Chapter 492. Is it possible to charge down Wei River City in one round? Lin Yuan raised his eyelids and asked. Gao Chuanjin was silent for a moment before honestly shaking his head. He said bitterly, Dragon King Darren, these little bastards don't deserve their reputation, but Wei River City is a fortress run by the Shenwu dynasty for many years. The city walls are hard and smooth. We can't get up without suitable siege weapons. There are also those ballistian cannons. Even if we build siege chariots, it's one thing to say if we can break open the gates, but it's another thing to say if we can reach the gates. Speaking of this, Gao Chuanjin was clearly listless. He said listlessly, if it wasn't for those siege weapons, none of the 10,000 people who left the city would be able to return alive. Today's battlefield was no longer the Azura field that Gao Jie was familiar with. The high walls of the city combined with all kinds of defensive equipment. Even the endless beast tide would be worn down to death, let alone the generals who were good at charging and breaking through enemy lines. Taking down the reserve general of the Divine Forest Guards was just a warm-up for a fierce general like Gao Jiezhen. But before he could vent his hot blood, the other side retreated back to Wei River City. Like a turtle that had retreated back into its shell, Gao Jiezhen felt helpless despite his peerless martial prowess. Just make it so they can't use it. Lin Yuan opened his mouth and showed a cold smile. In the next moment, the originally calm Wei River suddenly boiled and roared. Water dragons roared into the sky, and in the blink of an eye, it was as if the entire Wei River had turned into a dragon and stood upright. Even Gao Chuanjin, who had been on the battlefield for a long time, couldn't help but gulp. No matter how strong a cultivator was, they couldn't fight against the heavens and earth. Even Kongming experts who didn't fear water or fire would lose to the corrosion of time. Lin Yuan's method of borrowing the power of the heavens and earth was almost beyond Gao Chuanjin's understanding. Using his own power to move the entire Wei River for his own use. What kind of terrifying power was this? Gao Buzhen had seen similar battles before. It was just that at that time, the Falling Star Army was in its heyday. Nearly 10,000 cultivators of the water system were mobilized, and they only managed to turn a river less than 1/5 of the Wei River into a water dragon to help them attack the city. In that battle, they almost didn't encounter any decent resistance, because most of the soldiers and generals in the city had been drowned or knocked to death before they entered the city. While Wei River City would have corresponding defensive measures, with the Wei River pouring down, the siege weapons on the city walls should have been mostly destroyed. The cannons filled with water couldn't fire. In an instant, the battle returned to the rhythm he was familiar with. Trouble. The reserve officer of the Divine Forest Army on the city wall of Wei River City looked at the rising water dragons with a gloomy expression. This fortress built on the banks of Wei River couldn't be unguarded against the enemy using water to attack the city. The city had extremely advanced drainage channels. Once the water dragon pounced into Wei River City, it would quickly be swatted away by the drainage channels. But if such a terrifying water dragon came crashing down, the weapons on the city walls would definitely be destroyed, and the city gates might even be blasted open. The reserve officer took a deep breath and shouted, "Go to the storehouse and move rocks and sandbags to reinforce the city gates. Don't let the water dragons break open the gates." The elite soldiers selected from the various troops were naturally not weak. At the very least, they were able to withstand the pressure of the water dragons and not be killed on the spot. However, once the city gate was breached, it would not be a small matter for the people outside to rush in. For example, the general who led the team to scout the way was considered one of the strongest among them. However, he could not even last 3 moves against the silver-armored general. For these generals, cultivation didn't necessarily determine victory or defeat. Their mentality, martial arts skills, and even familiarity with battle formations would all determine victory or defeat on the battlefield. These were all very important factors. He didn't want to face the silver-armored general who was like a wolf or a tiger. The reaction of the officer on the city walls was very fast. But the moment he opened his mouth, the water dragons had already crashed down. The water dragons hit the city walls and suddenly exploded, turning into a large amount of water with a strong impact. It scattered the siege weapons on the city walls and washed away dozens of Shen Lin Jun's reserve soldiers who couldn't dodge in time. At the same time, they suddenly fell into the city. Most of them were drained away by the drainage system, but some of them hit the city gates hard. Gao Buzhan and the Shenlin Jun's reserve soldiers in the city all stared at the city gates. The city gates only shook twice but didn't break open. The officer on the city walls had a relieved expression on his face. But in the next moment, a white mist slowly rose. The Shenlin Jun's body that was still wet suddenly had large and small ice cubes appear on their bodies. They shivered and the city gates directly turned into ice gates. Charge! Lin Yuan glanced at Gao Buzhan beside him and ordered in a low voice. Gao Buzhan was slightly startled, but he quickly recovered. Gao Buzhan, who had already engraved obedience to orders in his bones, looked at the frozen city gates and directly turned over on his horse. He squeezed the horse's belly with his legs and roared, "Charge!" The 35,000 soldiers wearing the armor of the Fallen Star Army didn't hesitate. They followed closely behind Gao Buzhan and launched a charge toward Wei River City. Lin Yuan pushed back more than 10 meters. He wrapped 2 huge logs with his tail and threw them toward the city gates fiercely. His speed was several times faster than the charging group of Fallen Star Army. They hit the frozen city gates one after another. With 2 crisp sounds, the city gates that separated the 2 armies instantly shattered into pieces. Kill! Gao Buzhan's eyes lit up. The speed of his horse increased by 30% and rushed into Wei River City first. Gao Buzhan held an 18-foot-long mace in his hand. It was also silver-white. With just one wave, 4 Shenlin Jun who were originally near the city gates were smashed into pieces. The 300,000 Shenlin Jun's reserve soldiers in the city couldn't even block for a moment. They were directly knocked to the ground by the Fallen Star Army. They originally hoped that the thick city gates would bring them enough protection, but the bloody reality slapped them hard in the face. The 2 officers of the Divine Forest Army took a deep breath and raised the weapons in their hands to meet Gao Jiezhen. Although they weren't as strong as Gao Buzhan in the original army, they were still very strong. Being rushed by the enemy as if they were in a no-man's land, they felt ashamed. Chapter 493. In the past, the champion of the Myriad Swords dynasty had earned his reputation from the battle of breaking through enemy lines. Not to mention him, even the 5,000 veteran soldiers of the Fallen Star Army that he had brought with him could easily deal with these so-called elites. After all, they were completely incomparable to the experienced soldiers of the Myriad Swords dynasty. Seeing the 2 strong men rushing towards him, Gao Jiezhen was not in a hurry. He gently turned the mace in his hand and separated the 2 men's weapons. At the same time, he urged his war horse to charge forward. His left hand pulled the reins, and the war horse immediately reared up. Its 2 front hooves fiercely stamped on the chest of one of the generals, and immediately kicked him upside down. If it was Lin Yuan's body from his previous life, being kicked like this by a war horse, even if the gods descended, they would not be able to save him. However, the soldiers of the Tianwu continent more or less had cultivation. Even if they were not in the Heaven Dipper realm, they could not be hurt by ordinary animals. The general was just careless and was sent flying, but he was not hurt at all. With a flip of his body he regained his standing position. However, in this gap, Gao Jiezhen turned the mace in his right hand and easily knocked away the spear in the other general's hand. He then pulled the mace back, and the front end of the mace fiercely smashed the general's head. Suddenly, the general's entire head was smashed. The general who had regained his battle stance saw that his comrade had ended up in such a miserable state. Although his eyes were red, his fear eventually won over his anger. He actually lost the courage to go forward and fight with Gao Jiezhen. He turned around and ran towards the crowd. "Ahaha! Where do you think you are going?" Gao Jiezhen laughed for a while. His right hand just threw the mace forward, and in a flash, it hit the general's back. The general's body just trembled, and suddenly fell to the ground and died on the spot. A group of Shenlin Jun's reserve soldiers who came out with the 2 officers also trembled. No one dared to look at Gao Jiezhen, this killing god. After all, in the Wei River City where elites walked everywhere, those who could become officers were all ruthless people. Even the reserve soldiers were not to be underestimated. They were either king soldiers from the original army, or they were the 1 in a million geniuses among the orphans adopted by Shenlin Jun. If the two officers were placed in Shenlin Jun's reserve force, they would be considered to be at the top. Even in the reserve force, they would be able to fight against 100 people. Even the generals in Shenlin Jun's main force would not be at a disadvantage. However, at that moment, the two of them did not even have a chance to fight back under the high level of force. If they were not arrogant and wanted to join Shenlin Jun's main force as officers, they could have gotten rid of the reserve force and started as soldiers in the main force. If they could do it all over again, these people would rather be part of the main force than stay in Wei River City and face a killing god like Gao Jiezhen. Unfortunately, there was no chance to do it all over again. They would not know how much power Gao Jiezhen had exerted when he fought with them. They would not know how big the gap was between them and those soldiers who were also killed in one move. Gao Lijian was not in a hurry to retrieve his weapon. He just shook off the yellow and white substance on his right hand, and directly pulled out his sword from his waist and roared, "Brothers, teach this group of self-righteous little bastards what it means to be an elite. Kill. General Gao is invincible. Kill these little bastards." As the saying goes, a soldier is strong, but a general is strong. With such a ferocious general like Gao Jie, not to mention the 5,000 experienced veterans of the Fallen Star Army, even the 30,000 new soldiers felt their blood boiling as if they had inexhaustible strength. Their opponents, who were well matched in strength, were no different from chickens and dogs in their eyes. Therefore, their attacks were much more vicious than before. Witnessing this scene, Lin Yuan nodded slightly with a touch of relief in his eyes. In terms of individual quality, except for the 5,000 veteran soldiers of Fallen Star Army, the rest of the 30,000 soldiers were probably not as good as Shenlin Jun's reserve force. But at this moment, the two sides could evolve from fighting back and forth to a one-sided massacre. This was the role of morale. Even between elites and trash, the biggest difference was not the quality, but whether they wanted to and dared to fight this battle. Obviously, Shenlin Jun's reserve force, who were scared out of their wits, could not come up with a way to deal with Gao Jiezhen. Naturally, they lost their courage and changed from the initial formation to a timid look. These guys, do they have a backup plan? Lin Yuan paid attention to the movements in Wei River City, and could not help narrowing his eyes slightly. In a desperate situation, human beings often made two different decisions. One was to kneel down and surrender, and the other was to fight to the death. But Shenlin Jun's reserve force in front of him did not want to continue to be entangled with Fallen Star Army, and on the other hand, did not want to surrender. They changed from being evenly matched to a turtle tactic, constantly shrinking the line of defense. As long as they could not fight, they would not fight. Obviously, these Shenlin Jun's reserve force had a third choice. However, a moment later, Lin Yuan was surprised to find that he didn't know what kind of materials were used to build Wei River City. His eye of God could observe Wei River City from above, but there was no way to penetrate the buildings or the ground to explore whether there was a tunnel under Wei River City that could evacuate from this place. Since he could not come up with anything real, Lin Yuan could only keep silent and not interfere with Gao Jiezhen's battle. But he already knew that it was impossible to defeat these Shenlin Jun's reserve force in one battle. Fortunately, he had other preparations. Without the strong protection of Wei River City, even if the Shenlin Jun's reserve force could escape to various places in the north through the secret tunnel in the city, they could only be regarded as bandits who caused chaos. They could not do anything. Thinking of this, Lin Yuan could not come up with a solution at the moment. He could only let Gao Jiezhen be the scapegoat. He could not order Gao Jiezhen to disband the formation and attack the enemy's formation with all his strength, right? Not to mention the difference in military strength between the two sides. The military quality was even more incomparable. Once the formation was disbanded, it was not impossible for the Shenlin Jun's reserve force to turn around and defeat Fallen Star Army. Lin Yuan would never make such a stupid decision. After all, Gao Jiezhen was still very useful, and in a short time, he could not mobilize other troops to support Wei River City. Once they took back this city, this nail would be nailed to death. At that time, with the protection of Wei River City's defense equipment, most of the Shimwu dynasty could pass through Wei River and come to the north by boat. Even if they came in batches, it would be a bad result that Lin Yuan could not bear. Chapter 494. It was funny that 300,000 Shen Lin Jun's reserve soldiers were suppressed by 35,000 soldiers. No matter how many waves of counterattacks they organized, as long as they hit the 5,000 veteran soldiers of Fallen Star Army, all the attacks would be turned into nothing. Instead, they were pushed forward step by the opponent, gradually losing the geographical advantage of Wuxia City. Even the speed of shrinking the front line was accelerating. The way to deal with a fierce general was very simple. Let him be arrogant, go deep into the enemy's territory alone, and then encircle and kill him. But facing 5,000 fierce generals at the same time, as well as Gao Buzhan, who was one level higher than the fierce generals, could be said to be a peerless fierce general, and had extremely rich war experience, it was indeed a bit difficult for these little bastards. Looking at the whole Shenwu dynasty, only those old brothers in the past could compete with the 5,000 veteran soldiers of Fallen Star Army. But after decades, not everyone was as bad as Gao Buzhan and was excluded by the higher-ups. A small number of them retired and returned to their hometown. For example, the 5,000 soldiers of Fallen Star Army brought by Yan Xingqi were not implicated, but they were not willing to work for Lei Qiusheng. Most of them had now entered the army of Shenwu dynasty, and even held positions in the Ministry of War of the Imperial Court, and became important big shots. After years of living like royalty, how much courage could they still maintain? If it were not for the Shen Lin Jun, and the small number of soldiers of Fallen Star Army. With this army, Lin Yuan could stand proudly in the north and rule across the river from Lei Qiusheng, and not be attacked by the Shuangjian barbarian. After all, if the strength of both sides was equal, neither Lin Yuan nor Lei Qiusheng would blindly break the balance, because that would only be taken advantage of by others. Neither of them could laugh until the end. But now the military strength of Shenwu dynasty was far above the northern frontier, but the speed of growth was far slower than the northern frontier. That was why Lei Qiusheng was anxious to suppress the northern frontier, and was determined to strangle this giant in the cradle. That was why the Frost Mirror barbarian had entered the pass. But as the fighting became longer and longer, Gao Buzhan also got rid of the hot blood of returning to the battlefield, and looked at the problem with a calm attitude again. Soon, Gao Buzhan realized that something was wrong. Translator, Endless Fantasy Translation Editor. Endless Fantasy Translation. The Divine Forest Army's reserves were losing members too fast. Gao Jie felt that even if these 35,000 people were replaced with the main force of the Fallen Star Army, they would not be able to cause such a huge loss of members. As the enemy's defensive line became smaller and smaller, their battle formation also became smaller and smaller, sacrificing some soldiers in exchange for a chance to retreat. Gao Chuanjin frowned slightly, and his face suddenly turned cold. He raised the sword in his hand and said fiercely, "Everyone, follow me and charge." Seeing that Gao Buzhan had sped up the attack, the commander of Shen Lin Jun's reserve force also understood that his abnormal speed of losing soldiers didn't escape the eyes of the enemy. But soon, a determined look flashed across his face, and he shouted, "This guy has found out our intention. It won't be so easy to escape. Quickly seal the tunnel and face the enemy." As the voice fell, nearly 40% of Shen Lin Jun's reserve force in the field were defeated. The enemy only had 35,000 people. And with the loss of soldiers during the battle, it was estimated that there were less than 30,000 people left now. Even if they were all unstoppable, it was impossible for them to have such a big appetite to eat all of them. Therefore, in their initial estimation, they only needed to lose about 30,000 to 40,000 soldiers to protect most of the good seedlings and escape from here. Therefore, the outermost army formation was basically made up of old guys with inferior cultivation aptitude. They were all veterans who were willing to sacrifice themselves. But after this order was issued, the rest of the soldiers who had the chance to retreat were suddenly a little unhappy. Especially the few officers who were about to enter the tunnel. Their faces were so gloomy that it was almost dripping water. The commander's face was also gloomy, and he said coldly, "If those people rush in without caring about their lives, how long can we hold on? When we enter the tunnel, we will be caught. Not only will we have no way to survive, but we will also implicate our brothers who have already escaped." In the time it took to talk, the outermost line of defense had been completely torn apart. under the incomparable charge of Gao Buzhan. These so-called elites were just small soldiers who could kill dozens of soldiers with one strike. Seal the tunnel and prepare the camp. Although the face of the officer at the entrance of the tunnel was not good for a long time, his face was a little more relieved. Since this was fate, what was there to hesitate about? Even if he sacrificed himself in exchange for his brothers to escape, there would be a day when someone would avenge him. Yes, even if the situation had deteriorated to this point. These soldiers who had been instilled with the idea of being loyal to Lei Qiusheng still did not think that the Shimwu dynasty would lose this war. Right now, they were just letting that black Jiao be arrogant for a few more days. Without much hesitation, they decisively pulled down a mechanism. The tunnel entrance that was originally big enough for 3 to 4 people to pass through collapsed in an instant. The original entrance was already covered by sand, and it would take at least half a day to dig out the entrance again. Damn it! The sound of the tunnel entrance being destroyed was not small, and Gao Buzhan could clearly feel the tremors under his feet. Almost instantly, Gao Buzhan guessed what those people had done, and could not help but curse with a gloomy face. Outside the city, Lin Yuan also felt the change and guessed that the mechanism in the city had been destroyed. Although it was a pity, he could only shake his head lightly and sneered. If you want to wedge a nail, then so be it. Why did you have to choose to do it near Wei River? Courting death. In fact, the Shimwu dynasty had never considered the hidden dangers in the north. After all, the aristocratic families in the north were generally weaker than the south, and there was also the Hengduan Mountains in the north. Therefore, the only force in the north that could threaten the Shimwu dynasty was the Frost Mirror Barbarian. Wei River City was a fortress built by Lei Qiusheng. Not only was it used as a base for Shen Linjun, but it could also be used as a refuge for the descendants of the Lei family. Lei Qiusheng had never thought that the situation would deteriorate to the point that Shen Linjun had to leave his base. He also did not expect that the Hengduan Mountains, where there were many birds and beasts, would give birth to an anomaly like Lin Yuan. He actually used his own strength to mobilize the Wei River for his own use. He also did not expect that Lin Yuan did not mobilize all of his military forces to fight against the Shuangjian barbarian when the Frost Mirror barbarian invaded. Instead, he maintained his conquest of the entire northern territory. All kinds of situations that Lei Qiusheng had never thought of piled up together led to the fall of this so-called impregnable fortress. Chapter 495. However, the fall of the fortress was only the first step. Gao Chuanjin quickly rushed to the entrance of the tunnel. He frowned and thought for a moment. Then he found some soldiers who were still energetic and began to dig the ground. After 2 hours, they finally cleared out all the sand, revealing a dark and endless tunnel. Gao Chuanjin's face showed a little joy. The joy on Gao Chuanjin's face didn't last long. He calmly sent a group of soldiers down to explore the tunnel. He also told them that no matter if they met Shen Linjun's reserve soldiers, they should send someone back to report every half an hour. However, after several groups of people went down, not a single person came back to report. This made Gao Chuanjin's heart turn cold, because he didn't even hear the sound of fighting. In addition, he sent 3,000 to 4,000 people. It was impossible for them to not even have a chance to retreat before being wiped out by Shen Linjun's reserve soldiers. Then the only possibility was that there was something wrong with this tunnel. After reorganizing his thoughts, Gao Chuzhen chased away the joy of victory from his mind. He did indeed remember some rumors about Lei Qiusheng when he was building this fortress that was known as impregnable. At the beginning of the construction, the designer had built many secret tunnels filled with traps in Wei River City. Unless one had the original blueprints, one might die from the traps if they entered the tunnels. Even if one's cultivation was high enough that the traps couldn't do anything to them, it was easy to get lost in the labyrinthine tunnels. After that, in order to keep it a secret, even the designer was secretly executed by Lei Qiusheng. Only Shen Linjun's generals and temporary commanders knew the structure of the tunnels. These people were basically going to serve Shen Linjun for life until they died of old age. Their purpose was to ensure the absolute safety of this tunnel. After thinking this through, Gao Chuanjin could only bitterly laugh twice and accept the fact that he didn't want to accept. There was no way to break this tunnel. Either he got the blueprint or he could only leave it alone. In this battle, nearly 100,000 Shenlin Jun's reserve troops were annihilated. However, after the rest of the troops escaped into the underground tunnel, even a general like Gao Bujin, who had been through hundreds of battles, couldn't help but hesitate. He didn't even know how to face Lin Yuan. After all, they didn't know how long these tunnels were, how many changes there were, and where the exit at the other end of the tunnels was. Moreover, after losing 3,000 to 4,000 men, Gao Jiezhen didn't dare to take any more risks with his brothers. The only thing they could be sure of was that no matter how long this tunnel was, it couldn't go all the way to the central plains. After all, they didn't know how deep the Wei River was, and it was impossible for them to go around it. If they really dug such a deep tunnel, it wouldn't be able to provide enough support, and it could collapse at any time. At that time, not only would they not be able to protect the tunnel, even the fortress above ground would be destroyed together with it. Therefore, it was impossible for these Shenlin Jun's reserve troops to return to the central plains. They could only go to different places in the north through different secret tunnels, and then become a nail that was nailed into the palm of the northern frontier. Although Gao Jiezhen already knew that he couldn't do his best in this battle, the two sides were in a deadlock here. Compared to the Shenlin Jun's reserve troops escaping from under his nose, it was two different things. The former was just a lack of troops and siege equipment, but the latter was tantamount to pointing at his nose and calling him a piece of trash. Gao Jiezhen, who was helpless, could only secretly spit and curse. They claimed to be invincible, but in the end they dug so many rat holes in the ground. They want to be a whore and set up a monument to their chastity. It doesn't matter. They're just a group of defeated soldiers. At most, they'll be disgusting, but they won't be a big problem. Lin Yuan, who walked in from outside the city, comforted Gao Jiezhen and said with a chuckle, "Old Gao, I'll leave the construction of the defense line along the river to you. You must come up with your first plan within 3 days. This is your chance to become famous in the northern frontier. Although Li Zhong and the others will definitely raise objections, if you can make it perfect and pass it with a unanimous vote, then the impact on your future will definitely be different from the subsequent plans that need to be modified and pieced together." Hearing Lin Yuan's words, Gao Jiezhen's face also turned red, which was rare. Although he was ostracized in the Xinwu dynasty for decades, this didn't mean that Gao Jiezhen didn't care about fame. If that was the case, then why did he join the Fallen Star Army in the first place? Why did he have to risk his life to become a champion? Yan Xingqi had been exiled in the northern frontier for decades. Although his old subordinates still respected him, his prestige was not as high as before. Otherwise, under Yan Xingqi's call, there would be more than just Gao Jiezhen and his 5,000 old brothers who came to the northern frontier to join Lin Yuan. What really attracted Gao Jiezhen was the talent selection system of the northern frontier. In the northern frontier, one's background, wealth, status, and even reputation didn't matter much. If one wanted to become a real person in the northern frontier, then one needed to have enough ability. As a former champion, Gao Jiezhen was confident that he could occupy a place in the northern frontier military. However, after the establishment of the Northern Frontier Academy, Gao Jiezhen saw many talents in the field of military studies. This made him worry about his future position. His only advantage now was that he had rich experience on the battlefield. Moreover, he didn't need to study those basic courses on the battlefield to be able to directly enter the battlefield. If he couldn't establish his own authority now, then when the northern frontier was filled with bright stars in the future, he wouldn't have much room to do. And now, the defense line along the river was bound to become the first battlefield against the main forces of the Xinwu dynasty. Whether or not the northern frontier could withstand the first round of the Xinwu dynasty's counterattack would depend on how far-sighted this defense line plan was. Whether or not it could make the generals of the Xinwu dynasty rack their brains to think of a way to defeat them. As long as they could withstand the first round of the Xinwu dynasty's counterattack, even if the defense line was destroyed in the following tug-of-war, Gao Jiezhen could rely on this contribution to become one of the future generals of the northern frontier. Moreover, it would be an extremely dazzling one. It would definitely be more valuable than a champion in name only. Moreover, this defense line not only had to be impenetrable, But it also had to be exquisitely designed and inexpensive. Otherwise, with the financial resources of the northern frontier, if they wanted to carry out the Great Wall plan and the defense line along the river at the same time, there was no doubt that they would be unable to make ends meet. It was even possible that next year's financial resources would be overdrawn to the point of a deficit. Gao Jiezhen dismounted from his horse and knelt in front of Lin Yuan on one knee. He clasped his fist and said, "This subordinate is not talented. I can only repay the Dragon King with my life." Chapter 496. Apart from the brief interlude in Wei River City, the entire northern battlefield had entered a white-hot zone. The Yao beasts and demi-human warriors hiding in the forest taught the Frost Mirror barbarians a good lesson. For the first time, the Frost Mirror barbarians personally experienced that war wasn't as simple as being completely annihilated by the other side or completely annihilated by the other side. Under the command of the graduates of the Northern Frontier Academy, the demi-human army methodically divided the Frost Mirror barbarian army into pieces of meat that made them drool. Then, taking advantage of the terrain where the enemy's warhorses weren't suitable for charging in the mountains and forests, as well as the overwhelming advantage of the northern frontier's armaments, the demi-human army slowly devoured the Frost Mirror barbarian soldiers who dared to enter the mountains and forests. After losing nearly 200,000 soldiers, the Frost Mirror barbarian commanders also learned of the strategy of don't enter the forest. They didn't give the northern frontier a chance to divide and tear them apart, and took the initiative to disperse their forces and occupy the plains. In this way, the northern frontier army's lack of training was highlighted, and the quality of the soldiers was uneven. After all, in a large battle, your fellow soldiers and comrades would give you a chance to fill in the gaps. But in a small-scale battle, everyone couldn't even take care of themselves. Who would have the time to clean up your mess? However, the setback on the northern frontier was within everyone's expectations, and they didn't fall into a disappointing situation. They changed their previous aggressive attitude and concentrated their forces in the mountains and forests, or stationed them in places that the army had to pass through. In any case, they didn't continue to engage in small-scale battles with the Frost Mirror barbarian soldiers. This made the Shuangjian barbarian soldiers suffer, because their primary mission in the northern frontier wasn't to suppress the northern frontier, but to find the 13th prince. The 13th prince was the Frost Mirror Khan's favorite son, and he was even called Batu on the grassland, which meant the warrior of the grassland. In the Frost Mirror grassland where power determined status, having such a son ensured that Shuang Jihan would be able to protect his Xueliao tribe from being swallowed up by other tribes even if he was pulled down from the throne of Great Khan by other tribes. After all, the 13th prince's Xueliao cavalry was a tough nut to crack. Anyone who wanted to chew on them would have to grind their teeth off. Those tribes wanted to preserve their strength, so they naturally wouldn't engage in a bloody battle with the Xueliao tribe. But now they were trapped in the northern plains, unable to advance even half a step. Moreover, they did not know what was happening behind them. Even their supply line had been cut off by the Northern Frontier Army. Until now, not a single grain of rice had been sent in. Seeing that their rations were about to run out, they had no choice but to kill extra warhorses to satisfy their hunger. But where would they find extra warhorses? The Shuangjian barbarian soldiers could only kill the exhausted warhorses and replace their mounts with the other two warhorses that had not ridden into the northern frontier. This was tantamount to drinking poison to quench thirst, because if they didn't change their mounts, the most fatal problem for the cavalry would be their stamina problem. Originally, they could still plunder the cities in the northern frontier, but Li Zhong's strategy of erecting walls and clearing the wilderness left only a few troops disguised as Xinwu dynasty soldiers in the northern frontier. There was only a small amount of rations left, and it wasn't even enough to fill the gaps between their teeth. These soldiers who stayed behind to guard the northern frontier were basically doing it voluntarily. Their bravery was unparalleled, so it wasn't easy to chew on a hard bone. And even if they did, they wouldn't be full. After a few losses, they gave up on those cities. They didn't even know what to do with the captives they caught. It would be a waste to kill them. After all, although the Frost Mirror barbarian soldiers were good at fighting in the wilderness, they were not good at sieging cities. They didn't know that the northern frontier had removed the city walls, so they naturally had to keep a certain number of cannon fodder and slaves to prepare for a war of attrition against the cities of the northern frontier. It was exactly the same strategy as the beast tied when attacking human cities. Therefore, it wasn't unreasonable for them to be called barbarians. Apart from looking like humans, they were almost no different from monsters in the eyes of the other 6 great empires. But if they kept these people alive, they would have more food to feed. If this went on, they might even eat humans with bloodshot eyes. Before these Frost Mirror barbarian soldiers entered the northern frontier, they naturally didn't know that the aristocratic families and sects in the northern frontier had already been wiped out by Li Zhongxing. Under the operation of the embroidered uniform guards, all the wealth accumulated by those aristocratic families had been swallowed up by Lin Yuan. As long as the people in the cities were evacuated, the entire northern frontier would instantly become a battlefield. Without the obstruction of the aristocratic families and sects, this step was particularly easy. After all, no one wanted to live on the battlefield. There was no guarantee that they would lose their lives at any time. The supplies were transported by the supply caravans, and the routes of the supply caravans were basically in the mountains or places where there were large numbers of soldiers. With just these Frost Mirror barbarian soldiers, it was impossible for them to steal anything without paying a heavy price. Moreover, several times before they succeeded, the soldiers of the northern frontier actually set fire to the caravans and even fought directly on the burning caravans. In the end, the soldiers and the caravans were burned to ashes together. They didn't give them any supplies at all. In particular, these supply caravans were all from the Northern Territory Chamber of Commerce. These guys who had been traveling in the Hengduan Mountains all year round were not to be trifled with. They had to be on guard at all times against demonic beasts or other forces in the northern frontier. Their fighting ability in the mountains and plains was not much worse than the demi-human army and demonic beasts. They were the toughest of the toughest. After all, the 13th prince had been lost in the northern frontier. Now, even the main forces of the Frost Mirror barbarian soldiers were having such a hard time, let alone the 13th prince, who they had lost contact with for a long time. At this moment, most of the Shuangjian barbarian soldiers believed that the 13th prince, who had lost contact with the Frost Mirror grassland, had most likely died at the hands of the people of the northern frontier. Even the Bloodridge Knights, who were originally from the Bloodridge tribe, didn't believe that the 13th prince was still alive. After this period of fighting, the people of the northern frontier were fiercer and more barbaric than the Shuangjian barbarian soldiers. Many of the Frost Mirror barbarian soldiers were even thinking of retreating. They felt that it was useless to continue staying in the northern frontier. It was better for them to go back and recuperate. Although the Frost Mirror barbarian soldiers were allocated with 3 horses per person, they couldn't eat all of them. Although the people of the grassland knew how to fight, if they wanted to cross the Frost Mirror grassland on foot without horses, it was no different from suicide. The Shuangjian barbarian soldiers were gloomy. They even began to secretly complain about their ally, the Xinwu dynasty. After all, they had agreed to it on the surface. Until now, the Xinwu dynasty had not sent a single soldier to put pressure on the northern frontier. Otherwise, the Shuangjian barbarian soldiers would never have fallen to such a miserable state. Chapter 497. The war gradually reached its climax, but the Xinwu dynasty still didn't make a move. It wasn't that they didn't want to take this opportunity to attack the northern frontier, but the Frost Mirror barbarian troops entering the central plains were like fish entering water. Fighting cavalry in the endless plains was undoubtedly foolish. Thus, the Xinwu dynasty's army could only choose to retreat and defend the cities, leaving large areas of wilderness and villages to the Frost Mirror barbarian troops. However, even though most of the cities in the central plains were much more prosperous than the small cities in the north, their defensive capabilities couldn't be compared. They couldn't withstand the attacks of tens of thousands, or even hundreds of thousands of Frost Mirror barbarian troops. Almost every now and then, news of a city falling would reach the imperial capital. A group of aristocratic family heads, sect disciples, and nobles were all cowering in the temporarily safe imperial capital, trembling in fear. Although the Xinwu dynasty's imperial capital seemed to be absolutely safe for the time being, even the monarch, Lei Qiusheng, was aware of the problem. As the instigators, how could they not know how much the imperial army in charge of protecting the imperial capital had been corrupted by them? It would be safer for them to go up and fight against the ferocious Shuangjian barbarian troops, rather than rely on those young masters to climb up the city walls and fight against the ferocious Shuangjian barbarian troops. In an instant, the entire imperial capital was covered in a gloomy cloud of gloom. According to the style of these aristocratic families, they didn't care about anything other than their own land. If not for the fact that Lei Qiusheng was a powerful and tyrannical monarch, some people would have already begun to force Lei Qiusheng to give up large amounts of territory and recall the border troops to resist the Shuangjian barbarian troops. As for the consequences of doing so, they didn't care and didn't want to care. In any case, dying a few years later was better than dying now. I wonder what the situation is like in the north. A commander of the Blood Liao cavalry carefully wiped his blood-stained scimitar clean on an animal's skin before slowly sheathing it. Behind him were countless ferocious Blood Liao knights, as well as an even larger number of disheveled, and demoralized slave soldiers. In front of them was a burning city. Judging from the tall and wide walls, this city definitely had a high status in the Central Plains. However, not only did this rich city fail to stop the Frost Mirror barbarians' advance, it only served to increase their desire to plunder. After all, even though the Xinwu dynasty might not be as rich as the entire Shuangjian dynasty, a city in the Xinwu dynasty was definitely richer than a tribe in the Frost Mirror Prairie. Every day, he had a sickly look on his face and did not even attend court if he could. After all, once the officials gathered, there would always be an imperial censor who would come out to question him. Why were the 700,000 Frost Mirror barbarian able to bypass the border army's defenses and plunder the Central Plains? Why did the Xinwu dynasty suffer such heavy losses? Why didn't they send out a decent army to win 2 battles to vent their anger? Of course, Lei Qiusheng wouldn't say that this was a plan he had prepared to kill 2 birds with 1 stone. First, he could let the Frost Mirror barbarian invade the north and delay Lin Yuan's annexation of the north. This would give him enough time to pacify the south or mobilize his troops to fight the northern frontier. In addition, Lei Qiusheng had previously used his connections to transfer a group of Blood Liao knights into the northern frontier. It was as if a knife was hanging over his head. He wanted to take advantage of this opportunity to reorganize the northern defense line and get rid of all the generals who were close to Lei Qiusheng in one fell swoop before replacing them with trusted subordinates. But he didn't expect the Shuangjian barbarian to do this repeatedly. Not only did he want to attack the north, he didn't even let off his ally. After all, Lei Qiusheng couldn't announce that all this was because of his own mistakes, could he? In that case, how could he still be the emperor? Moreover, as a political expert, Lei Qiusheng could naturally see the real side of the matter from the layers of appearances. For example, the seemingly sharp questions of the imperial censor were actually just a prelude. Once the time was right, those aristocratic families would force him to cede a large amount of land to the Shuangjian dynasty and the Qingjiang dynasty in exchange for peace. Anyway, the one who would lose was the Xinwu dynasty, not the aristocratic families. Now that the Xinwu dynasty was in danger, if they continued to support Lei Qiusheng to fight on 2 fronts, and at the same time become enemies with the northern frontier, the inheritance of the aristocratic families that had been passed down for hundreds or even thousands of years would be destroyed in their hands. Of course, after this main goal was achieved, they would propose to withdraw the troops in various regions. It seemed that they wanted to reduce the expenditure of the national treasury, but in fact, they wanted Lei Qiusheng to disperse his cultivation and gradually lose the ability to suppress the aristocratic family's troops. Chapter 498. This was the main reason why Lei Qiusheng detested the aristocratic families. Lin Yuan was thinking of ways to eliminate different voices at the northern frontier. However, within the Xinwu dynasty, various factions were thinking of ways to weaken Lei Qiusheng's power. They didn't seek to pull Lei Qiusheng down from the throne, but at least they wanted to prevent Lei Qiusheng from killing them as he wished. Of course, people were greedy and insatiable. Once they weakened Lei Qiuxing's power step by step, the next thing they would do would be to covet the sacred artifacts and experience the feeling of taking turns to be the emperor. Lei Qiuxing was even a little envious of Lin Yuan. Although the northern frontier wasn't big, after a series of purges and suppression, the entire northern frontier was under Lin Yuan's control. If he wanted to fight a war, it would be fought. If he wanted to fight a war, it would be fought for as long as he wanted. No one dared to say anything. This was because the aristocratic families in the northern frontier were relying on Lin Yuan to survive. Once Lin Yuan fell from power, the entire northern frontier would be weakened and destroyed. This kind of method of attaching an entire force to a single person was extremely stupid. Once there was no outstanding successor, then the speed of the force's growth would be the same as the speed of its collapse. Lei Qiuxing knew that this method was stupid, but he still dreamed of becoming such an emperor. However, he was helpless. Back then, he was able to ascend to the throne by relying on his military power. However, with the abilities of those big shots, it was impossible for them to govern the region. Therefore, he could only use a large number of talents from the aristocratic families and sections. This resulted in the current situation where he couldn't get rid of his subordinates. Zhang Xiao, Lei Qiuxing, who was pacing back and forth in Yangxin Palace Hall, subconsciously called out. However, a trace of sadness quickly appeared on Lei Qiuxing's face. That person was no longer here. Actually, putting aside the fact that he was a surviving member of the Jiao clan, Zhang Xiao had done his best under Lei Qiuxing. He had managed the embroidered guard from nothing to a ferocious tiger that everyone feared. Although it couldn't be separated from Lei Qiuxing's great support behind him, it was enough to show that Zhang Xiao wasn't an embroidered pillow, like Lin Yuan had described him to be. On the contrary, Zhang Xiao was a great talent with real talent. Moreover, after decades of getting along with each other, the stubborn Lei Qiuxing had also treated Zhang Xiao as one of his few friends. Although they were not as close as Shadow, who had grown up together, they were still closer than Lei Qiuming. Now that there was a problem with the war strategy, Lei Qiuxing sadly discovered that he couldn't even find someone to discuss it with. After a while, Lei Qiuxing walked out of Yangxin Palace Hall with bloodshot eyes and strode to the yamen of the Servants' Administration. Greetings, Your Majesty. The Servants' Administration wasn't just one of the two intelligence agencies in Lei Qiuxing's hands. It was also a place that trained eunuchs and palace maids to serve the imperial family, nobles, and even high-ranking officials. For people born in this place, they had to remember the faces of even the students who had passed the imperial examinations, but hadn't had the chance to be promoted. How could they be blind when facing Lei Qiuxing, the ruler of a country? Lei Qiuxing waved his hand, indicating for the eunuchs and palace maids to stand up. At the same time he asked, "Where is my Shen Linjun now? How long will it take for him to return?" However, the response to Lei Qiuxing was a deathly silence. Suddenly, Lei Qiuxing's heart skipped a beat. There was even a hint of panic on his face. As his trump card, Shen Linjun's importance to him was self-evident. If something happened to Shen Linjun, not to mention the covetous eyes of the two empires, even Lin Yuan could step on his head and abuse his power. Speak. Lei Qiuxing fiercely stomped his foot, shattering a white jade tile as he roared in annoyance. An old eunuch with snow-white hair trembled as he knelt on the ground. He said bitterly, "Your Majesty, after Shen Linjun received Your Majesty's decree, he was stopped by Eunuch Tai before he could leave. I'm afraid he won't be able to return in a short period of time." Hearing that his shadow had left Shen Linjun in the south at such a time of crisis, Lei Qiuxing's face didn't reveal any strange expression. However, his heart grew heavier and heavier. This was because the shadow's action meant that there was an even bigger mess in the south. It was no longer a problem that could be solved by killing Lei Qiuxing or wiping out a few aristocratic families. The old eunuch quietly raised his head. When he saw that Lei Qiuxing hadn't delivered the goods, he lowered his head again and said, "According to the news that Eunuch Tai sent a while ago, those evil cultists who were banished overseas have now returned to the south to preach. Currently, a large number of people have already joined them. Eunuch Tai said that there are countless rebel armies in the south. There is no army that can be trusted. Only Shen Linjun, who is loyal to Your Majesty to the death, can take on this great responsibility and eliminate those evil cultists. Evil. Teach. Disciple. The moment these 3 words appeared, Lei Qiuxing only felt that his brain had exploded with a buzzing sound. His vision instantly turned white. As the actual ruler of the Shenwu dynasty, he knew too many secrets that others didn't know. He was very clear that the top forces who called themselves the Guardians of the Heavenly Gates were mortal enemies with these evil cultists. It wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that both sides had an irreconcilable hatred. They definitely wouldn't sit by and watch the evil cultists develop and grow stronger in the south. They wouldn't even let them enter the south. But now, not only had the evil cultists entered the south, they had even started to preach in the south. No one had come out to control them. Even the shadow had no choice but to disobey Lei Qiuxing's orders and intercept Shenlin Jun. He was prepared to let them take on the responsibility of eliminating the evil cultists at any time. However, the attitude of the Guardians of the Heavenly Gates had already explained many things. Since they could tolerate the evil cultists preaching in the south, it meant that they were willing to make almost any concessions other than directly sending troops to suppress the Shenwu dynasty. Ha ha ha, Lei Qiuxing opened his mouth and laughed bitterly. The sound coming from his throat was like a broken bellows. Your Majesty. The old eunuch raised his head with a worried expression. He looked at Lei Qiuxing, who had changed his usual shrewd style. He felt as if he was being chased, and his heart was tightly clenched. After all, these eunuchs grew up and learned in the palace. Their loyalty to Lei Qiuxing was definitely no less than that of Shenlin Jun. It might even surpass that of Shenlin Jun. After all, Shenlin Jun was a professional soldier. He could still live well without Lei Qiuxing. Even if he retired and went to a remote city to be a demon slayer or a mercenary, he could still live a good life. However, these eunuchs were different. Without Lei Qiuxing, they were just a group of lonely disabled people with no one to rely on. Even if their cultivation was high and their wealth was comparable to that of a country, they would still end up with no one to send them off in their old age. Their power, their lives, and even their everything were linked to Lei Qiuxing. Naturally, they had to think about Lei Qiuxing at all times. Chapter 499. This humble one is doing very well. Lei Qiuxing finally regained some clarity after hearing the old eunuch's call. However, he felt an inexplicable sadness in his heart. No matter how he viewed himself, the current rotten situation had become a mess that was difficult for him to clean up. This was especially true after Lin Yuan revealed his ambitions. Lei Qiuxing was in a state of panic and had taken many remedial measures. However, the more he did, the more mistakes he made, which led to the current situation. Even though Lei Qiuxing knew that as long as he had enough time to deal with the south, even if Lin Yuan completely took over the north, he would still have the strength to fight. However, the enormous pressure that had been accumulating in his heart day after day made Lei Qiuxing, blinded by greed, choose to open the border. He gritted his teeth and let the Frost Mirror Barbarian into the country, but he didn't expect that he would shoot himself in the foot. His originally resentful attitude completely changed after hearing the news of the southern evil cultists. He originally only treated Lin Yuan as an equal opponent, but he didn't expect that Lin Yuan's plans were even greater than his. The cultists had even bypassed him and directly contacted the most powerful forces. If the shadow had not happened to be in the south, it was likely that the cultists would have caused a huge ruckus before the report would appear on the shadow's desk. Because at this moment, Lei Qiuxing clearly understood that it wasn't just Lin Yuan. Even the civil and military officials of the court, as well as the top-level factions, all thought of him as the loser before the war even began. None of you are optimistic about this humble one's chances? This humble one is going to win this war no matter what. Lei Qiuxing suddenly took a deep breath and said in a low voice, Eunuch Zhua, this humble one doesn't have any trustworthy people by his side right now. I can only trouble the servants' administration to make a trip to the northern border. Have the troops there withdraw in batches to the central plains, and defend the imperial capital to the death. Without this humble one's orders, no one is allowed to fight on their own. Those who disobey will have their entire family executed. The old eunuch called Eunuch Zhuo was shaken. He looked at Lei Qiuxing in disbelief. as if this was the first time he had met this person. I am very clear-headed now. I know the consequences of doing so. Lei Qiuxing gritted his teeth and fiercely said, "Didn't they look down on me? They want this humble one's beautiful country, but this humble one will not give it to them. Even if they are lucky enough to beat this humble one this time, this humble one will leave them with a terrible mess." Yes. Eunuch Zhuo lowered his head again and pressed his forehead against the ground, trying to control his emotions. However, Frost Mirror Barbarian wasn't good at intelligence. Even if he disguised himself, his skin and demeanor were completely different from those who lived in a world where birds sang and flowers bloomed. Therefore, there were very few secret agents and spies in the Shuangjian dynasty. Even if there were a few similar organizations, they were short-lived. They were either destroyed in an instant or slowly fell into a useless state. Even though his blood eagle could hide in the Xinwu dynasty, it still couldn't obtain first-hand information. This was also the reason why he could slowly think of a way to solve the chessboard after receiving the information about the Xinwu dynasty. However, based on this outdated information, he could draw several conclusions. Firstly, his valiant 13th brother was already confirmed dead. Second, the strength of the northern frontier was far beyond their imagination. It was estimated that none of the people who entered the north this time could come out. Third, Lei Qiuxing had gone mad. The first two pieces of information were already speculated by him. Even if they were confirmed now, they weren't worth mentioning. However, the last piece of information made him cautious. In addition to the information he received this morning, Lei Qiuxing was going to withdraw the border army in the north and let them directly enter the rich and livable hinterland of the Xinwu dynasty to occupy territory and plunder treasures. In other words, Lei Qiuxing was going to use the entire Shuangjian dynasty as a knife and let them be the executioners whose hands were stained with blood. For Lei Qiuxing would get rid of all the major problems and directly reshuffle the power structure of the entire Xinwu dynasty. But what if he's not mad? The third prince's eyebrows, which had just relaxed, were tightly knitted together again. His expression was a little uncertain. He dared to use the Shuangjian dynasty as a knife. Wasn't he afraid that it was easier to invite the devil than to send the devil away? Chapter 500. The third prince sat in his own tent and frowned as he pondered. After a while, he realized that something was not right. How did Lei Qiuxing end up like this? It was because the Qingjiang Empire and Shuangjian Empire had joined forces with the Hengduan Mountains and the Dragon Palace of the Four Seas to attack the Xinwu dynasty at the same time. As a result, even the basic garrison troops were transferred to the front line. Although the front line looked stable, the interior was as soft as mud. Not to mention the northern frontier king and the Qingpeng king. Even the rebels could threaten Lei Qiuxing's position. However, why would the four forces join forces to attack the Xinwu dynasty? With the third prince's wisdom that did not match that of the people in the grassland, he quickly thought of the top forces that were above the empire. It was obvious that Lei Qiuxing had offended one of the top forces because of something. That was why there was a war everywhere, giving the aristocratic families and sects who coveted the high position space to cause trouble. After joining forces with Lei Qiuxing, the situation gradually became clear. The thing that made the top forces hate the Xinwu dynasty so much that they used all their influence to make the four forces join forces should still be in Lei Qiuxing's hands. Otherwise, both the Shuangjian Empire and the Qingjiang Empire would have withdrawn their troops and returned to the empire. After all, the monster horde in the Hengduan Mountains would not reason with them. Since they had no military strength, the neighboring empires would not miss this opportunity to loot a burning house. However, the strange thing was that the forces that bordered the Qingjiang Empire and the Shuangjian Empire did not attack them at all. It was only after they attacked the northern frontier that the monster horde broke out on the Shuangjian grassland again. All the signs pointed to the fact that the item was still in Lei Qiuxing's hands. Also, the reason why he dared to take the risk was that the item could help him turn the tables after his plan of driving the wolves to devour the tigers. He could destroy the Frost Mirror cavalry that invaded the Xinwu dynasty. Thinking of this, the third prince's forehead was instantly covered in a fine layer of cold sweat. Shakily standing up from his soft couch, the third prince walked step by step towards the door of the tent. This was not because his body was weak. On the contrary, the fact that he was able to maintain his fair and smooth skin on the frost mirror grassland was not because he was talented. Rather, it was because the third prince had cultivated at a terrifying speed since he was a child. He was only in his 30s, but he had already reached the Heaven Star realm. With his stellar energy protecting his body, he was naturally impervious to the cold wind. In terms of cultivation alone, the third prince was probably the strongest of the Frost Mirror Khagan's many sons. Unfortunately, leading an army into battle did not depend on the cultivation of the general. There were many other factors that had to be considered. Although the third prince was not inferior to the 13th prince in terms of strategy and adaptability, the third prince was not inferior to the 13th prince in terms of motivation, morale, and courage. Therefore, the 13th prince was Batalu, and the third prince was just the third prince. Your Highness, why are you? The two Bloodspan knights in charge of guarding the tent paled when they saw the third prince walk out of the tent. On the Frost Mirror grassland, where the 13th prince's fate was unknown, the third prince could not become the first successor of the Bloodspan tribe. However, the cunning third prince controlled the Blood Eagles. With the cunning of a fox and the eyes of an eagle, the third prince was practically the brain of the entire Bloodspan tribe. He spent most of his time in his tent, processing the intelligence reports from the Blood Eagles, and formulating a plan of action for the Bloodspan tribe. Unless something major was about to happen, the third prince rarely left his tent. After all, the intelligence reports were already outdated. If he did not check them in time and did not react in time, the entire tribe might be plunged into an unknown and desperate situation that concerned the survival of the tribe. The third prince looked at the guards with a pale face and said in a low voice, "This matter is of great importance. It is not convenient for me to meet with my father directly. I can only trouble you to go first and tell my father that no matter what he is doing, he is to postpone everything and wait for me. Just say that our Reflection Frost dynasty is in grave danger. If we don't handle this matter properly, not only the Bloodbath tribe, but all the other tribes on the Reflection Frost plains will be wiped out." What a guy! When the guards heard this, their faces instantly paled. The third prince never spoke without thinking. Now that he said this, it meant that a great disaster was about to happen on the Frost Mirror grassland. The guards did not know that the exhausted Shenwu dynasty would not be able to stop the Shuangjian dynasty from taking the imperial capital now that the army had moved out in full force. However, the third prince was never one to speak empty words. Many people even respected the third prince with titles such as prophet or sage. This was because the things that the third prince had predicted over the past 10 years were all reflected in the time and place that he had predicted. Yes, I will go and see the Great Khan now. After all, the third prince's guards were the brains of the Bloodspan tribe. Although they only had the title of a guard, their status was not inferior to the generals other than the princes. As long as they reported to the Great Khan, they would be able to see him. Also, the third prince turned to look in the direction of the Shenwu dynasty and said with a dark face, "We have to be prepared for both sides. My father has always favored the 13th prince, but it seems that he has died on the northern frontier. I am worried that my father will send troops out in anger and destroy all the tribes on the Frost Mirror grassland. Find a group of trustworthy people, and inform the chiefs of the other tribes to come here for a meeting. Even if we have to force him, we cannot let my father continue this war." The guard trembled and his face paled, but his eyes flashed with determination. He said in a low voice, "Yes." Everyone knew that Shuangjian Khan favored the 13th prince. However, they were both Shuangjian Khan's sons. How could the third prince, who was the most talented and the wisest, not be interested in Shuangjian Khan's throne? If he succeeded in forcing the third prince to abdicate this time, he would have succeeded the third prince. As long as he could win this war, he would be a big shot in the Bloodspan tribe and even in the Shuangjian dynasty. When the time came, the third prince might even allow him to leave with his tribesmen and establish his own tribe. For a better life in the future, for a lord who could rule over a region. It was a gamble. The third prince, who did not know the guard's complicated thoughts, sighed as he watched the guard leave. He looked in the direction of the Xinwu dynasty and murmured, "I hope it is not too late." Chapter 501. If the Shuangjian dynasty could get their hands on information, the northern frontier would naturally be able to get their hands on it. In fact, they would be able to get their hands on it much faster. Looking at the report on the table that had been confirmed by the Association of the Demon Emperor and the embroidered uniform guard, Li Zhong's eyes were filled with doubt. Was Lei Qiuxing crazy? Or was he making a huge gamble? Or was he trying to drag the northern frontier down with him? Li Zhong believed that a person at Lei Qiuxing's level wouldn't lose their will to fight just because of a momentary loss. He also didn't believe that Lei Qiuxing would make such a crazy decision. If that was the case, then he would have to wonder if the person who had invaded the country with a strong army was the current divine martial emperor Lei Qiuxing. Once the northern frontier army retreats back to the central plains, the Frost Mirror cavalry will be able to attack the Xinwu dynasty unscrupulously. Of course, they might also attack our northern frontier. Judging from the factors of this simultaneous invasion, the Shuangjian dynasty's tribes, big and small, should be more inclined to plunder the Xinwu dynasty, which is currently lacking in battle strength. However, the disappearance of the 13th prince will cause the Frost Mirror Khan to target the northern frontier. Lei Qiuxing's seemingly crazy move has hit the nail on the head. If we go to stop the Shuangjian dynasty, we will have to split off our already small forces to take over the defense line left behind by the Xinwu dynasty's frontier army. Not only will it be a waste of effort, but it will also be easy for Lei Qiuxing to attack us. However, if we don't stop the Shuangjian dynasty, we will have to face the most elite Shueliao cavalry. Without the Shueliao knights who could contend against the divine martial Chongbu, with the strength of the Xinwu dynasty's border army and Lei Qiuxing's plans, it would be more than enough to defeat the Shuangjian dynasty's invasion. When the time came, Lei Qiuxing would be able to reverse his decline and rebuild the morale of the army. Then he would be able to find an opportunity to fight us head-on. Right now, the northern frontier's strength is barely enough to deal with Lei Qiuxing, who has recovered 50% of his strength. Add to that the Blood Liao Knights attack, and we can't mobilize more than 30% of our troops. Unless Uncle Gao's defensive fortifications along the river are miraculous, Lei Qiuxing will be able to catch his breath and kill us with a single punch. Li Zhong muttered to himself. His eyes gradually regained their clarity. He said coldly, "What a Lei Qiuxing." Everyone's wisdom was different, and the level at which they looked at problems was also different. Eunuch Zhuo was on the first level, and he could only see the harm of Lei Qiuxing's move. The third prince was on the second level, and he could see the harm of Lei Qiuxing's move. He could also see the benefits from it, and derive a series of calculations. Li Zhong was on the third level, and he directly eliminated the areas that were harmful to the Xinwu dynasty. He found the most crucial point, and even used it to deduce the unfavorable situation the northern frontier would soon face. As for which level Lei Qiuxing was on, perhaps only he himself knew. When an expert made a move, the truth would be revealed. Lei Qiuxing had chosen between the north and the south to survive. On one hand, he catered to the north to force the south, but on the other hand, he was worried that the north would become too powerful and difficult to control in the future. Under this kind of worrying situation, no matter how good a card he played, it would be a lousy one. It would be very easy for Li Zhong, Lin Yuan, and other people with great wisdom to find the flaws, and then break his killing moves one by one and counterattack. Even at this point, not only had Lei Qiuxing not solved the trouble in the south, he had not even mobilized Lei Qiuxing and the rebel army in the south. If not for Lin Yuan's tit-for-tat by letting the cultists land in the south, perhaps the south would still be stable, and waiting for Lei Qiuxing to be forced into a corner by the northern frontier. At that time, no matter what conditions the aristocratic families in the south offered, Lei Qiuxing would have to pinch his nose and accept them, and the scales of victory would begin to tilt towards the interest groups in the south. At that point, whether it was Lei Qiuxing or Lin Yuan, they would both become losers. It was just a matter of who would lose more in the end. But at the moment when he was completely on the verge of defeat, Lei Qiuxing was able to sweep away all his worries and boldly adopt the method of no construction without destruction to meet the attack of the northern frontier. Moreover, he changed his previous scheming attitude and chose to use an open and aboveboard scheme. He made the Shuangjian dynasty his butcher's knife. While suppressing the northern frontier and sweeping away the aristocratic families in the Central Plains, he concentrated his forces to defend the imperial city and the nearby territories. With the Shuangjian barbarians' fighting style of bullying the weak and fearing the strong, he was bound to bypass the imperial city, which was a fat piece of meat, and directly sweep through the territory of the interest groups in the south. The cultists, the Frost Mirror Barbarian, and the interest groups in the south would first fight each other. And then Lei Qiuxing would suddenly close the door and beat the dogs, directly eliminating all the internal problems. Even the aristocratic families that gave him a headache were swept away by the Shuangjian barbarian. How many of them would be left unharmed? How many of them would dare to challenge Lei Qiuxing? How could he count on the aristocratic families near the imperial city that Lei Qiuxing was toying with? Moreover, the Shuangjian barbarian would not continue to attack the Shenwu dynasty. Instead, they would retreat to the Frost Mirror grasslands to lick their wounds. At that time, if the northern frontier still could not deal with the problem of the Blood Liao Knights, it would be a huge joke. Should he take this move or not? For the first time, Li Zhong felt that the wisdom he was so proud of was actually useless at this moment. He realized that compared to ambitious and ruthless characters like Lei Qiuxing and Lin Yuan, he lacked the most crucial thing, courage. He did not want to waste his energy fighting the Shuangjian dynasty, but he also did not want to take the risk of Lei Qiuxing rebuilding his confidence. At this moment, he did not know what to do. Your Highness, battle report. A guard strode into Li Zhong's office and placed a battle report on Li Zhong's desk. Li Zhong tore open the wax seal on the envelope and took out the letter. His face immediately turned ashen as if he had eaten a fly. While he was still making preparations, Lei Qiuxing had already begun to move. At present, most of the northern border army had been wiped out, and the rest were fighting as they retreated toward the Central Plains. After all, these border armies had been stationed at the border for many years, and had encountered the barbarians of the Shuangjian dynasty more than once or twice in the wilderness. While they might not be evenly matched, they would not be routed so quickly. This is troublesome. This is really troublesome. Li Zhong felt his temples throbbing with pain. Lei Qiuxing had actually played a dirty trick right in front of them. According to Li Zhong's usual logic, Lei Qiuxing's orders would be delivered to the border by trusted officials, and then the border army commanders would have to verify the authenticity of the orders before destroying the fortifications and slowly retreating to the vicinity of the imperial capital. But just as he received news that Lei Qiuxing was cutting off all means of retreat, the border army had already moved. What did this mean? It meant that Lei Qiuxing had given the Northern Frontier Intelligence Agency a vicious slap to the face. Chapter 502. Lei Qiuxing's order had already bypassed the intelligence system of the Northern Frontier and reached the border army. He pretended to be in the servants' administration, just to confuse the intelligence agency of the Northern Frontier. He wanted Li Zhong and the others to think about it for a while when they received the message. Then he would take advantage of the time to mobilize the border army. In this way, no matter how fast the Northern Frontier's response was, it would be a joke. Because the border army had started to retreat in an orderly manner. Could the Northern Frontier attack the border army under the pressure of the Shuangjian barbarian and cut off their retreat? If the Northern Frontier really had that kind of strength, how could they be forced to this step? At the same time, it was also a challenge. How many troops do we have left? Li Zhong looked up at the guard who didn't have time to retreat, looking very gloomy. The guard thought for a while and said bitterly, "The main force of the southern expedition is in the border army to carry out the plan of the Great Wall. Some of them are in the north to clean up the rebels, or to entangle the Frost Mirror Barbarian, who got separated from the main force. The Falling Star Army is now surveying the terrain near Wei River City, preparing to build a position to resist the naval attack of the Shenwu dynasty. The Subhuman Army is fighting with the demon beasts, so some of them are scattered in the forests. It's hard to gather them in a short time. If Your Highness wants to mobilize the troops as soon as possible, only the Northern Army hasn't been mobilized yet." Li Zhong was now a criminal. Without Lin Yuan's permission, The 100,000 guards of the prince's mansion were not allowed to leave Shunning City. They had already made a mistake once. If they made another mistake, no matter how good Li Zhong's reputation was, no one would be able to keep his head. Luckily, the Northern Army and the Northern Frontier could be mobilized, though the guards couldn't be mobilized. Li Zhong thought for a while and scolded with a smile. Mobilize the Northern Army? Then it's better not to do anything. The Northern Battlefront Army, which had just been expanded twice, was disbanded recently. Those experienced soldiers were all sent to the front line. Even the soldiers we lost in the rebellion of the 3 cities were sent from the Northern Battlefront Army. Do you think they still have people? Well, the guard touched his head and smiled. Even so, they are one of the 3 armies in the Northern Frontier. They can spare 100,000 soldiers, can't they? Your Highness, you think too much. He could tell that this prince didn't care about his own life at all. He knew that this was a job that would cost him his head, but he still wanted to take the 100,000 guards out and wrestle with the border troops of the Shinwu dynasty, who had retreated back to the Central Plains. You don't have to think so much. Li Zhong looked at the guard who was gradually walking away and shook his head with a bitter smile. However, a moment later, Li Zhong's face returned to its cold and indifferent expression. However, a trace of madness appeared in his eyes. Didn't you, Lei Qiusheng, want to play an open scheme with us and turn the area around the imperial capital into a place where anyone who touches you will have to stab their hands with blood? This old man doesn't believe in this evil. While you're organizing a defensive position, this old man will do his best to eliminate the effective forces in your hands and let those Shuangjian barbarian people bleed first. Let's see if you can still sit still on the fishing platform. Li Zhong's strategy wasn't weak. However, he didn't have Lei Qiusheng's boldness. However, this didn't matter. Even a rabbit would bite when cornered. If he couldn't find a way to deal with Lei Qiusheng's open scheme with his own courage, then he might as well give up on his reasoning and use an absolutely bold and crazy strategy. In any case, Lei Qiusheng dared to act as if he was going to drag the Northern Frontier down with him. How could the Northern Frontier not dare to accept this? However, on the surface, Lei Qiusheng wanted to drag the Northern Frontier down with him. However, he still had a trump card in his hands. It didn't matter even if he didn't achieve the desired effect. In any case, Lei Qiusheng was extremely confident that he would still be the ruler of the Shinwu dynasty. He wouldn't become a speck of dust in the long river of history because of a small disturbance. However, Li Zhong's crazy response was just a risky move. To put it bluntly, it was just a bluff. In his heart, he really did have some thoughts of dragging Lei Qiusheng down with him. Chapter 503. But it doesn't matter. After all, I still have the Dragon King behind me. The madness in Li Zhong's eyes gradually subsided. Lei Qiusheng had some unknown trump cards in his hands, but how could Li Zhong not have any trump cards in his hands? The situation had already become so dangerous, but Lin Yuan didn't show any signs of panic. He didn't even have the intention to recall the army in the south back to the northern frontier to fight together. That must be because Lin Yuan still had other cards that he hadn't played yet. Li Zhong knew his position, so he also knew that no matter how much power Lin Yuan gave him, he was still a puppet. And no matter how much a puppet struggled, it was still within the scope of Lin Yuan's ability. As long as Li Zhong wasn't stupid enough to cancel Lin Yuan's original arrangements and order all the troops in the northern frontier to die, then Lin Yuan would still be able to clean up the situation. There was indeed only one ruler in the northern frontier, but Li Zhong, as the king of the northern frontier, still had a lot of power in his hands. In addition, Lin Yuan deliberately molded Li Zhong into a positive figure who always thought for the common people. Anything that was beneficial to the people in the northern frontier would be credited to Li Zhong. The dirty work was basically done by people like Luo Su, Sherdong, and Xia Xiyu. This was because Lin Yuan was very clear that the law of the jungle could be absolutely observed in the Hengduan Mountains. But outside the Hengduan Mountains, when dealing with these people, he had to consider everyone's feelings from all aspects. For example, those capable officials who had real talent, hated war, and could really bring benefits to a region would definitely not be willing to serve under a warmonger like Lin Yuan. After all, Lin Yuan's actions were completely different from the ideals they had molded since childhood. Naturally, they wouldn't favor him, but the development of the northern frontier couldn't be done without them. Therefore Li Zhong appeared. With Li Zhong as the leader, it was a completely different matter. Not just the people on the northern frontier, even the arrogant sages of the Confucian sect mentioned the reforms on the northern frontier. Even though they knew that they were growing on the corpses of the noble families and sects, they did bring benefits to the people. They even removed the opportunity for the noble families and sects as middlemen, to suck the wealth of the people. The people received benefits, and so did the income of the rulers. Therefore, no one could go against their conscience and say that the reform of the northern frontier was a strategy to bring chaos to the country. Even though they all knew that the reforms and laws at the northern frontier were all made by Lin Yuan, the exotic beast, they still couldn't believe it. However, since Lin Yuan wanted to give the credit to Li Zhong, these humans agreed to it. They were willing to be blind and not come out to refute. Naturally, there would be talented people who didn't see the twists and turns in the process who came to the northern frontier. Therefore, Li Zhong's position in the northern frontier was very special, different from the previous two kings of the northern frontier. Although Li Zhong didn't have his own faction, his orders carried much more weight than the previous two kings. This was because he was assigned for Lin Yuan to recruit talents. Even if Li Zhong wanted to die, Lin Yuan had to find a way to protect him. I hope you won't walk on that path of death. Li Zhong placed his hands behind his back and sighed faintly. The situation at the northern frontier was indeed complicated. However, Zhang Qilin and Shen Linjun, who used to be reserve soldiers, were even more difficult to deal with. These people were 100% loyal to Lei Qiusheng. When Luo Su was teaching Li Zhongxing, Lin Yuan promoted Zhang Qilin and let him lead those people to build the northern army. Therefore, Li Zhongxing was under the subtle influence. His loyalty to Lei Qiusheng was no longer what it used to be. This time, Lei Qiusheng's action of no building without destruction had greatly impacted Li Zhongxing, who had been nurtured in the northern frontier. Therefore, Li Zhongxing, who was far away in the front line, might not be absolutely loyal to Lin Yuan. However, when it came to protecting the people of the northern frontier, Li Zhongxing would spare no effort to complete it. Therefore, the Great Wall plan would never have any mistakes. However, Zhang Qilin, who had been hanging out with those old brothers, wasn't affected by this. These people still maintained absolute loyalty to Lei Qiusheng. Since Lei Qiusheng could bypass the intelligence agencies of the northern frontier and move the border army to retreat under their noses, then it was impossible for him not to bypass their spies and send the secret edict to Zhang Qilin. At this critical moment, it was better to be stabbed by someone from the inside than to fight against those barbarians of the Shuangjian dynasty. Li Zhongxing stayed in the northern frontier as a prisoner because he wanted to keep an eye on Zhang Qilin and those old subordinates of Li Zhongxing. However, now that Lei Qiusheng had taken such drastic measures, only an idiot would let those border army soldiers leave. However, if he moved, no one could guarantee that Zhang Qilin wouldn't act rashly. Before this, the northern frontier's troops were all sent from the northern battlefront army. Of course, it wasn't because the soldiers of the northern battlefront army were strong and had good training. It was because Lin Yuan didn't want Zhang Qilin and those reserve soldiers of Shen Linjun to make the northern battlefront army into a private army. That was why he wanted to use this method to scatter those officers of Shen Linjun's reserve soldiers into different troops, so that they couldn't cooperate with each other. Two flowers bloomed, one on each side. Let's not talk about the scheming in the northern frontier for now. Li Zhongxing, who was near Donglin City, wasn't having a good time at the moment. Because of the Xinwu dynasty's border army's retreat, the original barrier naturally didn't exist anymore. Although the Xinwu dynasty's army wouldn't go deep into the northern frontier's territory, they wouldn't come near the border and cause trouble near Donglin City, which was heavily guarded. However, even if the Xinwu dynasty's army didn't come, it didn't mean that the Shuangjian dynasty's barbarians were so sensible. As soon as the border army retreated from the fortifications, the barbarians rushed in impatiently. After all, The border army had been ordered to defend the defensive line for the past few days. Not to mention supplies, even the scouts couldn't penetrate the defensive line. Therefore, the 1.2 million Frost Mirror Barbarian from before had completely lost contact with them. Now that things had developed to this point, it wasn't just a matter of the missing 13th prince anymore. If the 150,000 Blood Gold Knights were wiped out here, even Frost Mirror Khan wouldn't be able to stop the decline of the Blood Gold tribe, let alone the 13th prince. If the 1.05 million cavalrymen were also lost, who knew how many tribes would be wiped out this winter? Because of this, the chiefs of the Shenwu dynasty's territory were extremely anxious. They repeatedly ordered the northern frontier to release these warriors even if they had to suffer some losses. Therefore, more and more Frost Mirror Barbarian rushed into the Shenwu dynasty's territory like wolves and tigers, urgently wanting to get in touch with the vanguard troops. Chapter 504. Previously, Li Zhongxing had used a different strategy to eliminate the vanguard troops, so he could treat them as if they did not exist. But now that the Great Wall plan was halfway through, if he allowed this large wave of barbarians to pass through, the entire plan would become a joke. Moreover, even if these barbarians were not very smart, it was impossible for them to allow the northern territory to build a defensive fortification that could isolate them from their territory. Damn it, let's go all out. Li Zhongxing unsheathed the long sword at his waist and said fiercely, "Don't panic. Craftsmen, finish your work in an orderly manner. My men will escort you back to the safety of Donglin City in an orderly manner. Leave 5,000 men to guard the craftsmen. The rest of you, follow me and prepare to fight those barbarians." Almost all of the soldiers following Li Zhongxing were the elites of the southern expedition. Apart from the first batch he had brought out, the rest were all veterans who had participated in the encirclement and suppression of the rebel army in the north. Although the quality of their battle was not up to par, they had still been honed on the battlefield. These soldiers naturally exuded the aura of an invincible army. The Shuangjian barbarian army arrived in an instant, but they did not break through the enemy's formation and charge immediately. Instead, they set up camp 15 li away from Donglin City, seemingly intending to engage in a tug-of-war with Li Zhongxing's headquarters. This was the first time the two sides had met. Even the arrogant Shuangjian barbarian army did not dare to be careless at this moment. After all, the 13th prince, 200,000 Bloodridge cavalrymen, and 450,000 cavalrymen from various tribes had all been lost in the north. Now that the brothers who had invaded the Central Plains had regained contact with them, those who had entered the northern territory were like clay oxen entering the sea. It was as if they had disappeared directly. Given the barbarians' character of bullying the weak and fearing the strong, even if they had not personally experienced the battle with the Northern Frontier Army, they would still realize that the so-called information about the Northern Frontier being weak was all fabricated by the Shenwu dynasty to deceive them. The one who was truly weak was the Shenwu dynasty. However, now that things had developed to this point, the Mirror Frost dynasty did not have the spare energy to cause trouble for the Shenwu dynasty for the time being. After all, their brothers as well as the 13th prince, whom the Khan had placed all his hopes on, were all trapped in the north. If this matter was not handled properly, the Mirror Frost Khan would be enraged, and countless heads would roll. Both sides had merely set up a battle formation and were facing each other. Unexpectedly, neither side had any intention of taking the initiative to attack. The first day slowly passed by in this kind of stalemate between wanting to say something, but hesitating to do so. It was not until noon of the second day that a rider came out of the Shuangjian dynasty's military tent, claiming to be the messenger of the Khan of Frost. Li Zhongxing's camp was built behind the cement wall. Because the fortification had just begun construction, even with the help of cement, it was impossible to complete it in a short period of time. Moreover, this fortification was only outside Donglin City, and had not yet been connected to the planned cities. Naturally, the Shuangjian barbarian did not know that this was the wall of despair that they would encounter in the future. It was just a temporary fortification built by the Northern Frontier Army. The ranger in charge of guarding the place held the so-called messenger on the ground and carefully searched him. After making sure that he did not carry any weapons, he was escorted into the main camp to meet with Li Zhongxing. After entering the commander's tent, the messenger did not mock Li Zhongxing with a sneer on his face. Instead, he cupped his fist with a solemn face and said in a deep voice, "I am Keitung, the young chief of the Green Carp tribe in the Frost Mirror grassland. Greetings to all the generals." The moment his voice fell, all the generals in the commander's tent looked at each other in dismay. Then, their eyes fell on Li Zhongxing's face at the same time. It was said that the Shuangjin barbarian was rude and unreasonable. But now, this messenger had changed his usual behavior. There must be something fishy going on. "I am Li Zhongxing, the commander of the southern expedition in the northern frontier." Li Zhongxing sat on the tiger skin chair, looked down at Keitung and said in a deep voice, "The Shuangjin dynasty started the war without declaring war. First, they attacked our northern frontier territory. Now that the army is here again, the young chief has changed his usual behavior. This is really confusing." Hearing this, Keitung blushed. He cleared his throat and said, "There is something you don't know, Marshal Li. Our Shuangjin dynasty was deceived by a scoundrel. We didn't know that the northern frontier and the Xinwu dynasty had broken off relations. That's why we attacked the northern frontier territory. I'm sure you also know that our Shuangjin dynasty and the Xinwu dynasty have been at war for more than half a year. When we suddenly saw a hole in our border, we naturally wouldn't let go of this opportunity." Keitung's words weren't nonsense. After all, the northern frontier belonged to the Xinwu dynasty. Although the Frost Mirror barbarian clearly came for the northern frontier, they didn't penetrate the northern frontier, let alone enter the territory of the northern frontier. In addition, the Frost Mirror barbarian had come for the central plains. So if they braced themselves and said that they came to attack the Xinwu dynasty, no one could say anything about it. Oh, Li Zhongxing suddenly understood and raised his head. He smiled and said, "Young chief means that you attacked the wrong people?" Yes, that's what I meant." Keitung's face was still red, but it wasn't clear whether it was due to excitement or embarrassment. Li Zhongxing's face suddenly darkened. He said in a strange tone, "Young chief is so sure of this statement. Do you think that I and everyone else are fools? If our northern frontier army entered the Shuangjin dynasty and killed, and then we told you that we were actually going for the demon beasts in the Hengduan mountain range, would you believe us?" As soon as he finished speaking, the generals in the tent suddenly burst into laughter. Keitung's face became even redder. After all, they had all watched the Shuangjin barbarian invade the north. They didn't even look at them, who were disguised as the Xinwu dynasty's troops, and directly rushed to the northern frontier. If the Shuangjin dynasty really came for the Xinwu dynasty, how could they let go of the cities and troops in the north? Donglin City was intact, and they were unharmed. This was a ruthless slap to the Shuangjin dynasty's face. This is not the same." Keitung's face alternated between green and red. He whispered, "Your northern frontier army can directly enter the Hengduan mountain range. Why do you need to use our Frost Mirror grassland?" Li Zhongxing smiled and shook his head. He mocked, "Then why can't your Frost Mirror cavalry gather their forces and directly attack the central plains and take over the imperial capital? Why do you have to divide your forces to attack our northern frontier territory? You can divide your forces, but can't we?" Keitung's chest rose and fell violently. He stared fiercely at Li Zhongxing, but he couldn't spit out a single word. In terms of sharp tongues, even 100 of him wouldn't be a match for these people. But now he had to lower his head. Chapter 505. You're being bullied to this extent and you're still not angry? As Li Zhongxing mocked Kei Yan, his eyes flashed with a sharp light as he began to secretly plan. The Shuangjin dynasty hasn't changed much, but they also have experts on their side. They know that Lei Qiuxing wants to use them to clean up the families and sects of the Xinwu dynasty and suppress us at the same time. When the matter is almost done, Lei Qiuxing will make his move. At that time, those Shuangjin barbarian in the south of the Xinwu dynasty won't be able to come out. Therefore, they can only set their sights on the northern frontier, hoping to liberate their forces from our side, and ensure that the Shuangjin dynasty won't be greatly damaged by Lei Qiuxing's scheme. After all, after this matter is over, many forces will want a share of the profits. Suddenly, Lin Yuan's voice interrupted Li Zhongxing's contemplation. Li Zhongxing looked around and didn't see any signs of Lin Yuan's existence. He then heard Lin Yuan say, "I'm talking directly to you through my consciousness, so only you can hear my voice. You don't need to find out where I am. Just deal with the matter at hand, and try to stall for time. Wait for our people to kill the Frost Mirror Barbarian in the northern frontier, but don't deliberately cause a conflict." With Lin Yuan's support, Li Zhongxing's thoughts inexplicably calmed down. Clearing his throat, Li Zhongxing said with a smile, "Young clan leader, you don't need to take it to heart. I'm just complaining. If it were you, young clan leader, you wouldn't easily swallow this resentment after being beaten up for no reason, right?" "Yes, I don't know what request Commander Li has. Please tell us. The Shuangjian dynasty will do our best to satisfy you." Seeing that Li Zhongxing was giving him a way out, even though Kei Teng had been humiliated to the point of wanting to die, he had no choice but to pinch his nose and agree. However, this time, Kei Teng emphasized the words reflection of the Frost dynasty. He wanted to remind Li Zhongxing that he was not alone. There were still millions of reflection of the Frost cavalry outside. If the two sides could not come to an agreement, they would have to fight. If the two of them had a normal conversation, Li Zhongxing might have to think twice before bargaining. However, with Lin Yuan's support, Li Zhongxing no longer had any desire to negotiate. This was because Lin Yuan never intended to give him any face from the beginning. In the end, they would still have to fight. After pondering for a moment, Li Zhongxing's lips curled up slightly. He smiled and said, "Young clan leader, you're too polite. I'm just a commander. Even if I want to negotiate, I'm not qualified. How about this? Young clan leader, go back and rest for 2 days. I'll quickly send a letter to the Northern Frontier Mansion, and let the king of the Northern Frontier count the casualties before coming back to talk to young clan leader." Although Kei Yan was smiling, he was cursing in his heart. Of course, he knew that Li Zhongxing's rank wasn't high enough to negotiate with them. However, as one of the 3 commanders of the Northern Frontier, Li Zhongxing's words still carried a certain amount of weight on the Northern Frontier. More importantly, Li Zhongxing and his men were currently at the pass. As long as he didn't agree, his brothers trapped in the north wouldn't be able to come out. They wouldn't even be able to send in supplies. Who knew how many people would die in these 2 days? Licking his lips, Kei Yan asked tentatively, "Commander Li, I came here with sincerity. However, I don't see any sincerity from your side. How about you open a path and let the warriors of the Shuangjian dynasty, who mistakenly entered the northern frontier, return home?" Almost instantly, Li Zhongxing heard 2 cold snorts. One voice came from Lin Yuan, and the other voice came from a middle-aged scholar in a gray robe in the tent. The middle-aged scholar cupped his fists toward Li Zhongxing, then looked at Kei Yan with a gloomy face and said in a cold voice, "Warriors? Those barbarians may seem like warriors to you, but in the eyes of the northern frontier, they are complete sinners. This young master, your Shuangjian dynasty, wantonly invaded our northern frontier, committing all kinds of crimes. Now that you see that the situation isn't right, you send someone over to say a few words and want us to let them go? Isn't the price of invading our northern frontier a little too low?" "You are?" The corners of Kei Yan's mouth twitched as he gloomily stared at the middle-aged scholar. After all, Li Zhongxing's army was blocking the path that they had to pass through. No matter what, he was a mountain that could not be bypassed. The Shuangjian dynasty did not want to waste their military power in such a meaningless place, so they naturally had to say all they could. However, if it was someone else who came to talk to him, he would not be so good-tempered. If it were not for the fact that this middle-aged scholar was Li Zhongxing's subordinate, he would have already brandished his blade and cut him down. "Chen family of Taizong, Chen Zifang." The middle-aged scholar coldly stared back at Kei Yan without the slightest hint of panic in his eyes. Chen Zifang was a traitor on the side of the aristocratic families during the rebellion of the 3 cities. He might not be first-rate in terms of cultivation or strategy, but his insight was unparalleled. From the moment the northern frontier prince's residents began to carry out military orders, he understood one thing. Lin Yuan had no intention of letting go of the Shuangjian dynasty's cavalry that had entered the northern frontier. Chapter 506. As soon as Li Zhongxing's challenge ended, the generals and strategists in the tent no longer hesitated. They all stared at Kai Tung like hungry wolves, as if he was a piece of juicy pork. Just being stared at by the generals made Kai Tung break out in a cold sweat. He originally thought that these generals of the southern expedition were unwilling to go to war with the dual-sword dynasty. However, after Li Zhongxing spoke, their sudden change in attitude revealed the problem. They weren't afraid of going to war with the Shuangjian dynasty. Instead, they were worried that the crime of going to war with the Shuangjian dynasty at the northern frontier would fall on their heads. By then, no matter who won or lost, there would be rivers of blood on both sides. Whoever started the war would be the sinner. Now that Li Zhongxing had taken on the responsibility, they naturally didn't have any scruples. After all, they were all soldiers. Kai Tung could also understand the attitude of the generals of the southern expedition. If they didn't go to war, how long would they have to endure before they had the chance to be promoted? Marshal Li, you'd better think this through. The Reflection Frost dynasty has come with sincerity. As long as you release our people, we can negotiate any compensation you want. But if you insist on not giving way, we'll carve out a path of blood to bring our brothers home, even if we have to kill you. Kai Tung swallowed his saliva as he sensed the shocking killing intent from Li Zhongxing. His face turned slightly pale. Putting aside the fact that his cultivation wasn't as good as Li Zhongxing's, even if he could defeat Li Zhongxing in a one-on-one fight, there were still the generals of the northern frontier, and close to 1 million soldiers of the southern expedition. What was the difference between wanting to kill his way out of this military camp in his unarmed state? Li Zhongxing stopped and rubbed the tip of his nose. He sneered and said, "Haha, it seems like young clan leader is afraid." Nonsense. Kai Tung's face turned red again. He suppressed his voice and said, "The men of the Shuangjian dynasty aren't afraid of anything. It's just a misunderstanding between us and the northern frontier. Now that we're willing to apologize, why must Marshal Li be so overbearing? Do you think Marshal Li will still have a good reputation if we fight?" Clang. Li Zhongxing flicked the blade in his hand, pointing it straight at Kai Chun as he fiercely said, "Young patriarch, are you mistaken? Right now, it's the Shuangjian dynasty that's invading the northern frontier. I'm just protecting the country. I didn't send people to invade the Frost Mirror grassland to create friction. The Shuangjian dynasty was the one who started the war. Now you're the ones asking for peace. Young clan leader can't be so naive as to think that we, the people of the northern frontier, have no temper, right?" After all, the northern frontier's current thinking was that they were protecting their country. The responsibility of starting a war didn't even fall on them. But if they fought, the merits would be theirs. This, Kai Shen nodded with some difficulty and said helplessly, "Everyone, let's both take a step back. Before we reach an agreement, we won't ask you to release our brothers trapped in the northern frontier, but we ask that you provide them with supplies." Puffed. Chen Zifang sneered and said to the general next to him, "Hey Li Zhen, have you ever heard of a burglar breaking into your home, and then having to provide him with food and water after holding him down with great difficulty?" "Never heard of it." Like his name, Li Zhen looked burly and powerful, but he had a sharpness that didn't match his appearance. He didn't hesitate to cooperate with Chen Zifang and said with a smile, "In my hometown, when you catch a burglar, you don't even need to send him to the officials. Just beat him to death." "Aye." Kai Shen's expression darkened as he looked at Chen Zifang and Li Zhongxing. Before he could say, "I've tolerated you for a long time," he felt Li Zhongxing's blade getting closer to his neck. He could only bitterly say, "I know this request is a bit excessive, but those brothers can't just eat and drink, can they? Since Marshal Li also believes that this is a misunderstanding, why should we expand the conflict? If it really doesn't work, we can just send supplies to those brothers inside. Is that not enough?" Li Zhongxing lightly shook his head and said with a cold face, "Before His Highness's decree, your troops are not allowed to advance an inch. Otherwise, we will treat it as a declaration of war." At this point, Li Zhongxing glanced at the smiling Chen Zifang. Seeing that the latter was slowly becoming serious, he said in a low voice, "But your troops can give the prepared supplies to me. I will arrange for people to send them to the rear." Caitian's brows furrowed, and he couldn't make up his mind. Chapter 507. In the end, Keiting chose to give in and agreed to send the supplies to the Southern Expedition's camp. However, he also proposed to send some cavalry with good cultivation to transport the supplies. Firstly, he wanted to ensure that these supplies would not be used to support the enemy. Even if the Southern Expedition wanted to take these supplies, they might not be able to kill all the cavalry. If one or two escaped, the two sides might go to war. The consequences were not something Li Zhongxing could bear. Secondly, he wanted to see for himself the condition of the grassland warriors who had lost contact with the Shuangjian dynasty, and see if they were still worth saving. After all, they were now asking for peace with the northern frontier. This was equivalent to exchanging real money for the warriors trapped in the northern frontier. It was similar to the trade of people within the Shuangjian dynasty. The attitude of the northern frontier was obvious. Keiting did not think that the northern frontier's appetite would be small. Even the extremely wealthy Bloodbath tribe would have to fork out a huge sum of money to exchange for the Frost Mirror cavalrymen, not to mention the tribes that the cavalrymen originally belonged to. According to the rules, the tribes that the cavalrymen originally belonged to would have to pay at least 40% of the cost. If this amount of wealth was distributed to the various smaller tribes, it would be an astronomical sum that would suffocate them. Although the Frost Mirror grassland did not lack resources, due to the special living environment, they did not only trade animal meat, spiritual items, and other goods that were widely circulated everywhere. The extra people would also be treated as trade goods. If their own tribe could not afford to raise them, they would be sold to other tribes that had more resources but fewer people. As for their status, it was not a problem that the original tribe had to worry about. As for the remnants of a defeated army, they were clearly not worth the Mirror Frost dynasty's investment. How cruel. The corners of Li Zhongxing's mouth twitched slightly. His eyes were somewhat hazy. As a future top military officer of the Shinwu dynasty, he naturally knew what Keiting's actions meant. However, this did not mean that he could understand Frost Mirror's barbaric actions. In his opinion, if his fellow soldiers and comrades had fallen into such a situation, he would choose to save those who might still be alive no matter what the price was. He would also try his best to send the bodies of the dead back to their hometown for a proper burial. Unlike Frost Mirror Man, who regarded his compatriots as a resource and only traded with them when he could gain benefits from it, Frost Mirror Man did. If they were in the same predicament one day, would they be disgusted by their fellow soldiers' actions? After Keiting left the camp, Li Zhongxing waved his hand and dismissed all the generals and staff officers in the commander's tent. In order to prevent a troop from becoming the personal army of the commander, Li Zhong carefully divided each troop into different battalions. Every 10,000 men could form a battalion, and each battalion had a battalion commander, a deputy commander and 3 staff officers. Including the mid-level and low-level officers, any battalion of the 3 armies of the northern frontier could almost snowball into a huge army without falling into chaos. Although the battalion commanders and deputy battalions were all outstanding graduates of the military school of the Northern Frontier Academy, their backgrounds were completely different. Some were grassroots generals promoted by Lin Yuan from poor families, while others were descendants of aristocratic families who had submitted to Lin Yuan. As for the staff officers, one was from the Demon Emperor Association, while the other 2 were guests of Li Zhongxing and Qianhu of the Genie Guards. It could be said that each faction was stuffed into a battalion to check and balance each other. No matter what the characters and abilities of these people were, they all had their own factions behind them. Naturally, it was impossible for them to get along well. After all, everyone had their own interests. Only very few people would believe in feelings and loyalty. Of course, in order to prevent each faction from harming their comrades for their own interests, Li Zhongxing also adopted a system of punishment. For example, once disobeying orders, the battalion commander, deputy battalion commander, and 3 staff officers would not be able to escape. It was fine if it was impossible, but if anyone was determined to drag down the northern frontier, before facing the anger of Lin Yuan and Li Zhongxing, they would still have to wrestle with the other 4 big shots. Unless all 5 of them were determined to betray the northern frontier, just the difference in strength alone was enough to send those disloyal fellows to hell. It was also because of this system of appointment that although Li Zhongxing was nominally the commander of the southern expedition, and could mobilize any unit, he could only give a general strategy and detailed battle objectives. The degree of completion, and the plan of completion were all discussed by his subordinates. If Ke Ting had not come to the meeting as an emissary of the Shuangjian dynasty, the northern frontier generals and staff officers would never have gathered in Li Zhongxing's tent. Now that the meeting was over, even if Li Zhongxing did not ask them to leave, they would not stay here for long. After all, no one knew when the war would start. If they had the time to chat here, they might as well go back and sharpen their weapons. Dragon King, I'm not doubting you, but I feel that your way of doing things is no different from playing with fire. After everyone had left, Li Zhongxing casually threw his saber to the side and sat down on his tiger skin chair. He said in a deep voice, "Since you don't intend to negotiate with these barbarians, you shouldn't keep them in suspense. Now that things have come to this, it's really not easy to end things." Lin Yuan's projection slowly condensed in Li Zhongxing's commander's tent. A cold glint flashed in his different-colored eyes as he sneered. "I want to use the fate of these barbarians to tell everyone that no matter what schemes they have behind the scenes, if they don't have the determination to fight to the death with the northern frontier, don't interfere. Otherwise, this king will directly chop off their hands. Do you think it's better to settle things once and for all, or to drag things out slowly?" At this point, Lin Yuan paused for a moment and said, "The Northern Territory Chamber of Commerce has indeed brought in a lot of profits. Before this, it could almost support the simultaneous operation of several projects. But after the war started, 2/3 of the reform and construction projects in the northern frontier were suspended, and all the money squeezed out was used to fund the various troops. Because of this, the various departments still owe the soldiers their salaries. Although the equipment from the Ministry of Works and the Ministry of War has been equipped with all of you, they have only paid you a portion of the cost of the materials. They still haven't paid you the labor fees and salaries." A string of black lines slowly appeared on Li Zhongxing's forehead. Of course, he knew that war costs money, and a lot of it at that. For example, the Shunwu dynasty had been peaceful for decades. Even if the officials were greedy, the treasury was still considered rich. It wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that Lei Qiuxing slept on a mountain of gold every day. But how long had it been since the war on 4 fronts started? The treasury of the Shunwu dynasty had basically been emptied. Chapter 508. After all, you're a general now. You can't think in such a simple way. Theoretically, I should only pay you the salary of the South Expedition Army. Actually, you should be concerned about the expenses and rations of the surrendered troops and captives. However, I still paid the bill for you. As of now, your South Expedition Army is growing larger and larger in scale. Did I tell you to stop?" Lin Yuan sat up and said calmly, "Anyway, I don't want to fight the Shunwu dynasty and the Shuangjian dynasty slowly. If you want to let these people go, you will have to fight at the front when the Frost Mirror Barbarian invades next time. Also, don't expect me to pay you a single cent outside of the establishment." The corner of Li Zhongxing's mouth twitched slightly. He held back the swear words that were about to come out of his mouth. He didn't have the national treasury of the Shunwu dynasty that had been peaceful for decades, nor did he have the terrifying beast that was the Northern Territory Chamber of Commerce. If he had to support an army of millions of people, wouldn't that be asking for his life? But Lin Yuan's attitude was very clear. He didn't want to fight this war. Whoever wanted to fight would pay. Li Zhongxing wanted to complain about this kind of rascal behavior, but he didn't know how to say it. After all, the Southern Expedition's military strength was several times greater than the establishment that Lin Yuan had given him. And as the work of cleaning up the Northern Territory continued, this number was still increasing. When the war was over, they would definitely be dealt with. But Li Zhongxing didn't want to be forced into a dead end because of this matter. Then if all 500,000 Frost Mirror barbarian soldiers are lost at the northern frontier, how should we deal with it? Now that the Shuangjian dynasty has taken the initiative to beg for peace with us, it seems that they are prepared to bleed a lot. But not only did the Dragon King not give them face, his actions are no different from starting a war. If they really go to war regardless of everything, it will be no less than a disaster for our northern frontier. Li Zhongxing cupped his fist at Lin Yuan and said in a deep voice, "Am I right?" Li Zhongxing, who was disgusted by Lei Qiuxing's action of abandoning the people in the northern territory, couldn't tolerate sand in his eyes now, especially after experiencing the good life of the people in the northern frontier. Li Zhongxing couldn't be said to be loyal to anyone now. The only thing he wanted to protect was the people in the northern frontier, who had sacrificed everything for their livelihood. Lin Yuan said that he wasn't willing to go to war with the Shuangjian dynasty, but at the same time, he was provoking the Shuangjian dynasty. He couldn't figure out the meaning behind this at all, so he could only look at Lin Yuan with a confused gaze, hoping to get an answer. Chapter 509. Isn't that the case? Li Zhongxing's eyes widened. If all 500,000 Frost Mirror cavalrymen are killed, it'll be a blood feud. Those barbarians will never let it go. They'll have to go to war eventually. Your actions will definitely bring the war forward. Li Zhongxing felt that the more he listened, the more confused he became. It seemed that Lin Yuan was right, but his reason told him that this was all sophistry. Lin Yuan definitely had other plans behind his back. After such a huge feud, even if Frost Mirror Khan didn't want to go to war with Lin Yuan, those tribes would definitely force him to send troops to the northern frontier. After all, only some of them were unlucky now. Once the war started, the northern frontier and the whole Shuangjian dynasty would be in trouble. Even if it was for the survival of their own tribes, most of them would choose to go to war. Frost Mirror Khan is like a wolf. Before they're full, they'll keep following you. When you show a weakness, they'll pounce on you and tear your flesh apart to fill their stomach. If you don't want to, you can only raise your weapons and beat them until they're scared. Only then will they tuck their tails between their legs and show their more dog-like side. They'll stay away from you and won't dare to provoke you for a while. If we show weakness now, the Shuangjian dynasty won't be grateful to us. Instead, they'll think that the northern frontier is only strong on the outside but weak on the inside. After they've healed their wounds, the first thing they'll do is to invade our territory and burn, kill, and pillage. By then, it'll be an endless war. Mirror Frost had fallen into Lei Qiuxing's trap. Not only were the 700,000 Mirror Frost cavalrymen trapped in the Central Plains unable to come out, even more Mirror Frost cavalrymen would be trapped in this deadly trap. Based on this battle alone, I am certain that at least half of the Shuangjian dynasty's border army near the Xinwu dynasty will be destroyed. Apart from the border army, the tribes near the Xinwu dynasty will also lose many young and strong men. Of course, we weren't the only ones who knew that Lei Qiuxing's concession was a trap. The Shuangjian dynasty knew it too. The reason they wanted to make peace with us was to preserve their strength as much as possible, so that they wouldn't lose too much of their strength. They might even lose the edge of the Frost Mirror grassland, so that their ranch could become our hunting ground. If both sides worked together and the beast tied in the Hengduan mountain range, the Shuangjian dynasty might not even be able to recover from the setback. Speaking of which, if we can't determine the victor between us and Lei Qiuxing, then we need a way out. Therefore, the Shuangjian dynasty's invasion this time is a way for us to ease our relationship. At that time, we can choose to call a truce and head north together to collect this debt of blood from the Shuangjian dynasty. Then, we can return to our respective territories and start accumulating strength for the next war. But this time, if we sign a truce, we won't have an excuse to head north to attack the Frost Mirror grassland. Naturally, we can't join forces to attack the Shuangjian dynasty. Even if we shamelessly call a truce, the other dynasties won't just stand by and watch us attack the Shuangjian dynasty. If they cut off the trade with the Northern Territory Chamber of Commerce, we won't even have a place to cry. So they only need to withstand the pressure from Lei Qiusheng. Lin Yuan narrowed his eyes slightly and smiled. I don't want the northern frontier to fall into a two-sided war. I just want to tell these barbarians one thing. The northern frontier will never back down from a fight. As long as they want to fight, I'll fight with them. Plus, there's a special tribal system there. Before we can catch our breath, Shuangjian Khan's throne will probably change hands. Do you think that Shuangjian Khan, who has dominated the grassland for 50 years, will do such a profitable business for a bunch of dead people? This, Li Zhongxing's eyes widened even more. He said with a puzzled expression, since the Shuangjian dynasty has already seen through the trap, won't they know to withdraw and wait for the right opportunity? They'll attack us when we fight with Lei Qiusheng. No matter who they help, or whether they fight on both sides, they'll still benefit from it. That's what we need to do. Fan the flames, add oil. Let this fire burn even more fiercely. Let the Shuangjian dynasty suffer the greatest loss and force them to swallow their anger. The coldness in Lin Yuan's eyes slowly faded, and turned into an obscure emotion. I'm slow-witted. I don't understand what the Dragon King means. Li Zhongxing shook his head with a bitter smile. However, he was sharp enough to smell the blood in Lin Yuan's words. In the end, weren't they still going to fight? Sophistry indeed. The loss of 500,000 Frost Mirror Barbarian is not an unacceptable loss for the Shuangjian dynasty, because the number of young men who die from the cold, starvation, or being killed by demon beasts on the grassland is far more than that. However, for some tribes, the loss of these young men is a disaster. They won't accept this result easily, so they'll do everything they can to recoup their losses. For example, 500,000 Frost Mirror Barbarian died on the northern frontier, but 700,000 Frost Mirror Barbarian killed and looted as they pleased in the Central Plains. If they want to recoup their losses, do you think it's better to start a war with the northern frontier, or go to the Central Plains, where they think it's incomparably prosperous, and even plunder for a while more in the south? If we show enough strength, the Shuangjian barbarian will wisely choose to avoid us and hold this grudge in their hearts for the time being. However, in the current situation, their first choice is still to plunder the Shenwu dynasty. This wise decision is what both Lei Qiusheng and I want to see. The only ones who want to stop them are the higher-ups of the Shuangjian dynasty. However, the tribes that have suffered losses won't let go of such a good opportunity, especially the small and medium-sized tribes outside the range of Frost Mirror Khan's influence. Even if they pretend to be obedient, they won't let go of such a fat piece of meat like the Shenwu dynasty. Lin Yuan's voice trembled as he said, Lei Qiusheng used the bones of countless people to build a path to victory for himself. In this aspect, he's even more of a bloodthirsty demon beast than this king. But you also said that the Shuangjian dynasty already knows that this is a trap. Before Li Zhongxing could finish his words, his face turned pale and he swallowed dryly. He suddenly realized that Lin Yuan, this demon beast, knew more about the situation of the various factions than he, a professionally trained officer, did. The unique tribal system of the Shuangjian dynasty was no different from that of the demon beasts in the Hengduan mountain range. However, the beast lord Kirin could intimidate countless demon beasts, but the old Frost Mirror Khan didn't have such strength. Although he was revered as the king of the grassland, the small and medium-sized tribes outside the range of the Blood Liao tribe's influence had never obeyed Frost Mirror Khan's orders. Chapter 510. The harvest of 700,000 Frost Mirror Barbarian in the Central Plains was enough to make most of the Frost Mirror tribes jealous. It was also enough to drive the tribes that had suffered heavy losses crazy. Even if the Frost Mirror Khan ordered them not to enter the Shenwu dynasty's territory, they wouldn't listen. Lin Yuan's act of killing 500,000 Frost Mirror Barbarian was equivalent to pouring oil on Lei Qiusheng's trap. The fire that wasn't strong enough to begin with instantly engulfed more than half of the Frost Mirror grassland. And this was an overt scheme. Unless the Shuangjian dynasty was willing to start an all-out war with the northern frontier, they could only choose the seemingly weak Shenwu dynasty. This king isn't as ruthless as Lei Qiusheng. but this king loves his own people more than Lei Qiusheng. Lin Yuan finally regained his composure and said with a smile, "No one knows what Lei Qiusheng's trump card is. This king doesn't want him to use it on the northern frontier. It's better to send him more Frost Mirror Barbarian. When he can't hold on anymore, he'll naturally reveal his trump card in advance." "I know what to do." Li Zhongxing nodded with a serious expression. No one knew what Lei Qiusheng's trump card was, but in this situation, unless Lei Qiusheng went crazy, he definitely had something that could change the situation in an instant. Letting Lei Qiusheng use this thing on the Shuangjian Barbarian was obviously much better than using it on the northern frontier. Although he didn't like this kind of scheme, it wasn't his own doing. However, this wasn't his doing, and it was indeed for the sake of the entire northern region. Therefore, even if Li Zhongxing didn't like it, he could only persuade himself to accept and even obey. The next morning, Kei Yan led 30 Shueliao cavalry and 200+ carriages of supplies, his face solemn as he arrived at the Southern Expedition's scouting area. After yesterday's meeting, Li Zhongxing had no intention of stopping him. Very quickly, he led the 5,000 light cavalry to the front of the formation. Marshal Li looks a lot more energetic. Kei Fan rubbed her hands together. She had dark circles under her eyes, and it was obvious that she hadn't rested well. In fact, Li Zhongxing had also gone through a lot of mental struggles last night. But after thinking it over, she still decided that Lin Yuan's actions were the most beneficial for the northern frontier. It was also the best way to break Lei Qiusheng's trap. At the very least, it was the method with the least losses. So, for the latter half of the night, Li Zhongxing didn't continue to brainstorm with herself, and fell asleep peacefully. But looking at Kei Yan's appearance, Lei Qiusheng knew that this young clan leader of the Green Fish tribe didn't have a good time after returning home yesterday. The arrogant and unreasonable Shuangjian dynasty had lowered their proud heads, but they didn't get the respect they deserved from the northern frontier. The situation they were facing was completely different from what they had expected. Not only did the northern frontier not show the slightest bit of fear, they even seemed to be full of fighting spirit. But even if the northern frontier wanted to fight, the Shuangjian dynasty didn't. They only wanted to preserve their strength and wait until the northern frontier and the Xinwu dynasty had a decisive battle before coming to take advantage of the situation. There was no need for them to help that bastard Lei Qiusheng fight the vanguard after falling into his trap. At least, that was what the generals of the Shuangjian dynasty convinced themselves. But according to Kei Yan's report, the northern frontier didn't plan to release the captives immediately. They wanted to send the message back and wait for the reply from the northern frontier prince's mansion before deciding on their next move. Before that, they couldn't even send their supply wagons past the Southern Expedition's position. They could only send some cavalry to accompany the Southern Expedition to transport the wagons. In the words of those scholars, the behavior of the northern frontier was no different from being shameless when they were given face. But they couldn't do anything because, just as Lin Yuan had predicted, the Shuangjian dynasty didn't plan to fight this battle. So they could only vent their anger on Kei Yan, the envoy. As a result, Kei Yan looked like he was going to collapse at any moment. Li Zhongxing glanced at Kei Yan and said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, "I didn't expect young clan leader to be so knowledgeable about the situation of our brothers trapped in the northern frontier." 500,000 Frost Mirror Barbarian soldiers wasn't a small number. These 200 wagons of supplies were only enough to fill the gaps between their teeth. Although the defense line of the northern frontier wasn't that tight, the intelligence network formed by the Association of the Demon Emperor's members and the embroidered uniform guards wasn't something that the Shuangjian dynasty could infiltrate. So the Shuangjian barbarian soldiers who were still defending the plains definitely hadn't made contact with the main forces. So Kei Yan's 200 wagons of supplies were just a pretense. At the same time, it was also to express his distrust of the northern frontier. Kei Yan smiled helplessly and wiped the sweat on his forehead. He said with an apologetic smile, "Marshal Li must be joking. Just by looking at your southern expedition, I know that the northern frontier's army isn't ordinary. We know our own strength. How could those good-for-nothings be a match for your northern frontier's army, let alone 500,000? Even if they had 200,000 left, they would be burning incense to thank the gods. At this point, Casual paused for a moment before continuing. We're just going to take a look at the situation today. Although the supplies we brought are better than nothing, they should be able to last for half a day. Once we confirm the situation, we'll be able to make preparations. Li Zhongxing expressionlessly pulled on the reins and turned his horse around. He said coldly, "I'll say the ugly words first. Your cavalry had better behave themselves. If they do anything inappropriate, I have the right to kill them on the spot. Also, after confirming the situation, you can prepare for the next shipment, but all of your cavalry will have to come back with you. Do you understand this?" "Understand my ass?" Kei Yan's face suddenly darkened. He didn't expect Li Zhongxing's slap to come so quickly and so suddenly. They had prepared such a small amount of supplies in order to annoy Li Zhongxing and make his men make a few more trips. Of course, there was no lack of distrust in Li Zhongxing. They were worried that the southern expedition would seize too much of the supplies, which would be considered an act of aiding the enemy. But Li Zhongxing's attitude was also very clear. "You don't trust me, and I don't trust you. You think I'll seize your supplies? I think you're using this method to increase your troops." But then again, both sides were just trying to annoy each other. They didn't really suspect each other of doing anything. After all, the supplies were only enough to fill the gaps between Li Zhongxing's teeth. Even if Li Zhongxing seized them, they would only be able to fill the gaps between their teeth. With the troops around him, they could eat all 200 carriages of supplies in 1 or 2 meals. Although the dozens of cavalry were all in the late stage of the airborne realm, such a small number of people was definitely not enough to increase the number of troops. What was the difference between increasing the number of troops in such a scale and sending them to their deaths? Chapter 511. Marshal, what should we do with the Frost Mirror cavalry that came with us? A light rider rode up to Li Zhongxing, a faint murderous intent flashing across his fair face. The fair-skinned young general was a graduate of Qiao Yu's batch. However, unlike Qiao Yu, who was known as Black Bear, due to his simple and honest nature, Qiao Yu was known as the Black Bear, which made him the type of general who would charge and break through enemy lines. On the other hand, the fair-skinned young general, Zhang Xiuzhu, was more of a scholarly general. His training was decent as well, having reached the pinnacle of the airborne realm before the age of 30. He was only one step away from reaching the celestial star realm. Li Zhongxing was also one of the military mentors of the Northern Frontier Academy. Qiao Yu and Zhang Xiuzhu were both students that he thought highly of. Although they had their own shortcomings and were not as good as Qin Yu and Zhao Guangchong, who were taught by Lin Yuan and were able to lead troops to the south as soon as they graduated, he still wanted to get closer to Li Zhongxing. To be fair, Zhang Xiuzhu was not worse than the students taught by Lin Yuan. He could become a famous general after some training. However, his biggest weakness was hatred. Zhang Xiuzhu's parents were both civilians. They did not even have the ability to move to other places to live, let alone have the ability to cultivate. Therefore, every year when the Frost Mirror Barbarian raided the border, Zhang Xiuzhu and his parents could only rely on luck to avoid being killed. However, luck would always run out. When Zhang Xiuzhu was 7 years old, the Shuangjin dynasty raided the border. His parents were killed by the sword, and only the young Zhang Xiuzhu escaped by hiding in a secret cellar at home. Since then, the seed of hatred had been planted in Zhang Xiuzhu's heart. Lin Yuan set up the Northern Frontier Academy and supported poor students. This was a great opportunity for Zhang Xiuzhu, and he did show his extraordinary talent. Compared to the children of aristocratic families who grew up with spiritual objects, Zhang Xiuzhu, who started cultivating in his 20s, could not achieve much. However, there was no limit to human perseverance and potential. Zhang Xiuzhu, who had a blood feud, was far more hardworking than the other students in the same batch. His cultivation, the art of war, and even strategy were all excellent in almost every subject. However, when everyone thought that Zhang Xiuzhu could win Lin Yuan's favor and become the most dazzling star of the Northern Frontier in the future, this guy rejected Lin Yuan's olive branch without hesitation and went straight to the main camp of the southern expedition. From Zhang Xiuju's point of view, it was impossible for the southern expedition army to continue south in a short period of time. However, the cleanup work in the north still had to continue. Apart from those clans that were still stubbornly resisting, the Frost Mirror barbarian cavalry that pillaged the border would be the Southern Expedition Army's main opponent for a very long time. And Zhang Xiuju was indeed capable. After a series of tests, Li Zhongxing believed that this guy, who was not much younger than him, would become the most dazzling star of the northern frontier in the future, even if he rejected the recruitment of the so-called Star General class. Therefore, even though he knew that Zhang Xiuju was currently on the southern expedition, he would divide the southern expedition in the future and take part of the people to form a new army to wrestle with the Shuangjin barbarian. Li Zhongxing gladly accepted Zhang Xiuju as his disciple and even trained him as his successor. However, Zhang Xiuju's performance in the past 2 months had indeed proved that he deserved Li Zhongxing's favor. In response to this proud disciple's question, Li Zhongxing only raised his eyelids and said through secret voice sending, "The Shuangjin dynasty has 35 cavalry with them this time. Apart from the heavy military supplies we have, you can only take 50 people with you. How do you think we should deal with them? Kill them." A cold light bloomed in Zhang Xiuju's eyes as he replied without hesitation. Li Zhongxing was silent for a while. Zhang Xiuju scratched the back of his head and said with a smile, "Marshal is not a person who makes arbitrary decisions, but with your authority, it's not impossible for you to let the Shuangjin barbarian go. However, you chose to stall for time without discussing with us. This action already shows that Marshal has no intention of letting those barbarians go. Moreover, you're not the only one who has an opinion on this matter." Huh. Li Zhongxing smiled noncommittally. He just waved his horsewhip gently, indicating for Zhang Xiuju to leave. Just as Lin Yuan had said, Li Zhongxing was a chicken when it came to strategy. His current actions could only deceive the Shuangjin barbarian. However, those in the southern expedition with discerning eyes could see that Li Zhongxing, who had always followed the advice of others, had chosen to use stalling tactics to cut off the Frost Mirror barbarian's chances of survival. It was obvious that someone was guiding him behind the scenes. And although Li Zhongxing was the king of the northern frontier, he only had the authority to make suggestions. He did not have the authority to directly command the commander-in-chief of the northern frontier's 3 armies. If it was Li Zhongxing's idea, then Li Zhongxing would still have to discuss it with them before deciding whether to do it or not. That was why the entire southern expedition was so quiet. No one argued with Li Zhongxing like Li Zhongxing did with Lin Yuan. The reason was very simple. Most of them were already scared out of their wits by Lin Yuan. Lin Yuan had never tasted defeat since his debut. Therefore, they could not see the depth of Lin Yuan's decision. Even if they could see it clearly, no one would overestimate themselves and ask Lin Yuan to correct it. When Zhang Xiuju gradually rode away, Li Zhongxing once again said through secret sound transmission, "Just say that it was my idea. Go to that place and pick a group of ruthless people to go with you. First, lead them around in circles. After you have shed all pretense of cordiality, you must do it cleanly. Don't leave any hidden dangers." Speaking up to here, Li Zhongxing paused and smiled. Besides that, Wei River City has been breached, and there are still over 100,000 reserve troops of the Divine Forest Army gathered near Songtao City. We can't clear them out for the time being, but we have to let these Frost Mirror barbarians vent their anger, right? This general will not disappoint the Grand Marshal. Zhang Xiuju pulled on the reins and turned his head to look at Li Zhongxing. His white face squeezed out a bright smile. As for how to use these 200 carriages of supplies to provoke the conflict between the Frost Mirror barbarian and the Shun Lin Jun reserves, he had already outlined a rough plan in his mind. At the same time, he also guessed what Black Jiao, who gave him today's position and opportunity, was planning. Keiting stared blankly at the two people's lips moving. He subconsciously felt his heart sink. But when he listened carefully, he could not understand what they were talking about. Although they were speaking the common language of Tianwu continent, the words they spat out were all numbers. For someone like him who did not know the code of the northern frontier, it was no different from listening to a heavenly book. But his keen sense of danger still made him feel that the southern expedition was secretly planning something. Chapter 512. Young clan leader, why are you in a daze? Li Zhongxing urged his horse to the side of the hesitant Kai Tung, and lightly poked him with the end of his whip. Only then did Kai Tung wake up from his deep thoughts. His entire body seemed to have been startled, and cold sweat began to appear on his forehead. That was my favorite student, but his personality is a little weird. He doesn't know how to speak the common language of the Sky Martial continent, so we were using a special secret signal to communicate. I told him to go back and pick 50 capable brothers to escort you on this trip. Is there any problem on your side? Kai Tung finally calmed down. When he looked at Li Zhongxing again, he discovered that he was smiling warmly. Gently shaking his head, Kai Tung forced himself to calm down and said, "But I heard that the northern frontier isn't very peaceful right now. Can 50 people really escort the supplies safely to the destination? Why don't we discuss it again and have both sides send more people?" When he heard the number 50 people, the stone in Kai Tung's heart slowly fell. After all, the cavalry of the northern frontier couldn't be compared to the cavalry of the Shuangjian dynasty. Even the horses they rode were inferior war horses bought from the Shuangjian dynasty. Even if their cultivation was higher, 50 people against 35 people might not have more than a 50% chance of victory. And even if they could defeat them, it was impossible to keep all 35 of them at the northern frontier. As long as one or two escaped, the northern frontier wouldn't be able to take it. Even Kai Tung, who had always believed in his intuition, felt that he was being too cautious, and even a little oversensitive. Li Zhongxing lightly shook his head and bitterly smiled. To be honest, although there are many hidden dangers in the northern frontier, the real threat is the Frost Mirror Cavalry and Xin Linjun's reservists that we couldn't completely eliminate. With your people here, even if we bump into the Frost Mirror Cavalry, they won't do anything. And if we encounter those reservists, even 2,000 people won't be able to do anything. But if the number of people is smaller, the target will naturally be smaller, and it will be much safer. Kai Tung stared blankly at Li Zhongxing. Xin Linjun was the trump card of the Xinwu dynasty, and was also the trump card of Lei Qiuxing's dragon throne. Even the reservists were quite a formidable existence. Furthermore, Wei River City, which was known as the Impregnable Fortress, was also a famous existence. But now, the reserve force of the Divine Forest Army had been defeated, and even Wei River City had been breached? What kind of monsters were these people? Thinking of this, Kai Tung's last trace of hostility towards the northern frontier completely dissipated. He bitterly smiled and said, "If that's the case, then we'll do as the Grand Marshal wishes. I'll go inform them to prepare to depart." Although the men of the Shuangjian dynasty didn't lack courage and bravery, the special living environment still made them have the personalities of wolves and dogs. Just as Lin Yuan predicted, the stronger the northern frontier displayed, the more the Shuangjian dynasty didn't want to provoke the northern frontier. But Kai Tung, who was just about to leave, suddenly remembered something. He abruptly pulled on the reins and said, "Our 13th prince was deceived by the Xinwu dynasty some time ago and led his troops into the northern frontier's territory by mistake. It's been almost half a month since then. I wonder if our 13th prince is a guest at your residence?" Although the third prince speculated that the 13th prince was dead, the proud Shuang Jianren didn't think so. In their eyes, the northern frontier was just a group of nouveau riches. They might not even be able to withstand the counterattack of the Xinwu dynasty. How could they offend the Shuangjian dynasty at this time? Therefore, even if the 13th prince went on a killing spree in the northern frontier, he only needed to announce his identity after he was defeated. Not only would the northern frontier not dare to touch him, they would even treat him as a guest of honor, and wait for the Shuangjian dynasty to take him away. "Young master, you must be joking. I haven't heard any news about the 13th prince." The warm smile on Li Zhongxing's face instantly disappeared. He said coldly, "I will write another letter to ask the northern frontier's residents. However, I advise you not to have any delusions about this matter. You know our Dragon King's personality. The Shuangjin dynasty has sent troops to invade the northern frontier one after another. If they don't pay a price, they will lose face. This. Keiting originally thought that taking the 13th prince out was just a matter of convenience. After all, they could let the 500,000 Frost Mirror barbarians go. If they let a few more people go, they wouldn't be criticized. However, Li Zhongxing's cold attitude was telling him to stop dreaming. The Shuangjin dynasty would definitely pay a price for these two invasions. Between the 500,000 Frost Mirror barbarian and the 13th prince, he could only choose one. I still have military matters to attend to. Farewell. Without waiting for Kei Yen to quibble, Li Zhongxing cupped his fists and urged his horse to rush towards the army camp. He's trying to sow discord. When Li Zhongxing disappeared from sight, Keitung threw the horsewhip in his hand to the ground. Between the 500,000 Frost Mirror barbarians and the 13th prince, this was a choice that even a child could make. However, when it came to Keitung, he couldn't make up his mind. Not to mention that among the 500,000 cavalrymen trapped in the north, at least 60,000 of them were Greenfish clan's disciples. The other clans who had lost some of their men were all hoping that their men could return safely. Because of this matter, Keitung, the envoy, was treated with great respect. Gifts that Keitung didn't even dare to think about before were prepared and sent directly to his tent. There were even some tribes that used beauty traps. Their goal was to make Keitung protect as many of their tribesmen as possible. Once Jueqi gave up on the 500,000 Frost Mirror barbarian cavalrymen and chose to bring the 13th prince back to the imperial court, he would be tied to the Bloodliao tribe. Once the Bloodliao tribe collapsed, there would be no place for the Greenfish tribe to stay in the prairie. If Kan Shuang had been young, it would have been fine. Unfortunately, Kan Shuang had been seriously injured when he was young. His cultivation had not improved in the past few years, and his body was deteriorating day by day. There was no telling when he would pass away. Although there were many outstanding princes in the Shuoyao tribe, the most outstanding ones were the 3rd and 13th princes. Of the two of them, one was a scholar and one was a martial artist. If these two forces could not be merged together, the decline of the Bloodstream tribe would be inevitable. But from what he knew, the relationship between the 3rd prince and the 13th prince could be said to be irreconcilable. However, if Keitung chose the 500,000 Frost Mirror barbarian and gave up on the 13th prince, then what awaited him would be the fury of the Bloodspan tribe. Those tribes wouldn't care about his friendship. In the eyes of the prairie people, they had already prepared a generous gift for Keitung. Keitung bringing back their tribe's young men safely was his duty. Only a fool would fall out with the Bloodstream tribe in order to protect Keitung. Chapter 513. Xinwu Dynasty, Imperial Capital. Lei Qiuxing paced back and forth in Yangxin Palace with his hands behind his back. He glanced around the empty palace with a gloomy face. The entire Yangxin Palace was filled with a gloomy atmosphere. Anyone who got close to the palace would find it hard to breathe. Lei Qiuxing's plan had only begun to work now. After opening up the borders, the border army under his command retreated to the Central Plains. Although they might not be able to confront the Frost Mirror cavalry head-on, they could still defend the imperial city and the nearby cities. Before the war began, Lei Qiuxing had already ensured his own safety. However, the northern frontier did not have such a good condition. The northern battlefront army was still in the north. Most of the soldiers in the southern battlefront army were new recruits. Even the old soldiers were just average. They were much weaker than the elite soldiers in the border army. The only force that could give him pressure was the Fallen Star Army that Yin Xingqi had trained. But the number of soldiers was too small. In a large-scale battle where more than 1 million soldiers were involved, what could 5,000 soldiers do to him? Lei Qiuxing could never imagine that any army in the northern frontier could fight the Shuangjin barbarians' main force head-on. Therefore, when he knew that the Shuangjin dynasty was approaching Donglin City, Lei Qiuxing was so excited. He wanted the Shuangjin dynasty to charge in and destroy the entire northern frontier. Then he could clean up the mess. However, the Shuangjin barbarians stopped. Their main forces didn't act like before, recklessly charging into the northern territories to burn, kill, and plunder. Instead, after encountering the Southern Expedition Army that Lei Qiuxing deemed to be unable to withstand a single blow, they suddenly stopped advancing. Both sides even began to communicate. If the Shuangjian dynasty reached a peace agreement with the northern frontier, it would be a terrible nightmare for him. After all, his trump card was still in the preparation stage. If the northern frontier lost the Shuangjian dynasty's restraint, not only would they be able to quickly annex the entire northern territory, they could even deploy a series of battle plans along the river, waiting for his army to smash their heads and bleed. That's right, his head was broken and bleeding. Although he felt that the army at the northern frontier was mediocre, they were from the Shenwu dynasty and not the Qingjiang dynasty, which had the best navy in the world. Letting his meticulously trained divine martial heavy steps cross the Wei River to fight was equivalent to throwing iron cans into the Wei River. Who can tell me what the situation is in the north? Without Zhang Xiao, is your embroidered guard all trash? Lei Qiuxing's gaze swept across the shadows of the Hall of Mental Cultivation as he roared angrily. If I had known that the embroidered uniform guard was only at this level, I would have let the Servants' Administration take over the Northern Intelligence Network. Do not challenge this monarch's patience. You must send me the latest intelligence on the north within 4 hours. Furthermore, all of this monarch's orders must be completed with the highest priority. Yes. Understood. As you command. Several feeble voices rang out from the shadows. The embroidered uniform guard's intelligence network in the north had not been disbanded, but due to Lei Qiuxing's suspicious nature, the original officers had all been purged and replaced, regardless of whether they were loyal to him or not. There was no lack of spies that he had personally placed by Zhang Xiao's side. Changing generals at the last minute was a huge taboo in the army. Coupled with Lei Qiuxing's bloody purges, the entire embroidered uniform guard felt insecure. They couldn't even guarantee their own safety, so who would focus on gathering intelligence and establishing a spy network for him? Moreover, in this kind of intelligence network, there were often hundreds or thousands of spies lying dormant in a single command. Only by extending this network could a complete and mature intelligence network be formed. Zhang Xiao had transferred away a group of loyal higher-ups of the embroidered uniform guard, and Lei Qiuxing had purged them himself. Currently, it was unknown how many spies were in contact with the embroidered uniform guard, but didn't have official identities. After all, their command lines were already gone. Who could verify their identities? Under such circumstances, the current situation of the embroidered uniform guard wasn't as simple as just rotting away. It was even on the verge of collapse. Lei Qiuxing still had delusions that the embroidered uniform guard could maintain the powerful operational capabilities that it had when Zhang Xiao was still in power. This was no different from a fool's dream. Of course, this kind of intelligence network was different from the military system. At the very least, the bloody purge of the higher-ups had shocked most people. There wouldn't be an army mutiny. As long as there was enough time, the embroidered uniform guard's original structure could definitely be restored. However, if he wanted to restore the all-pervasive scouting ability of the North, he would have to ask the Shifter Emperor Council and the embroidered uniform guard if they were willing to do so. Since you knew it would be so troublesome, why didn't you kill it back then? When I dealt with Zhang Xiao, I had the opportunity to kill it. It was just a matter of convenience. A black shadow flashed, and the shadow that was supposed to be overseeing the south slowly appeared behind Lei Qiuxing. Lei Qiuxing shook his head lightly and said bitterly, "The Black Jiao is indeed a difficult opponent, but it cannot die. At the very least, it cannot die now. And it cannot die at our hands." Oh. The shadow raised its eyebrows imperceptibly, as if it was curious about this statement. With the Black Jiao as the representative of the northern frontier, the Black Jiao has already set its sights on those top powers. Because of the previous incident, the Black Jiao has shown the ambition and ability to replace me. Those top powers are definitely begging for it. Otherwise, why do you think the chaos in the Shenwu dynasty has continued until now? Isn't it just those guys who are creating opportunities for the Black Jiao and stalling for time? In addition, the relationship behind the Black Jiao is also complicated. Forget about the ancient demon court. whose real identity is unknown. Anyway, it can establish a relationship with the top powers. Even if its identity is fabricated, it doesn't matter. However, its current identity is the Lord of the Northern Frontier and the Beast King of the Hungduan Mountains. It is also inextricably linked to those dragon blood demons. All the forces are trying to rope it in. If the Black Jiao dies at this time, not only will the Northern Frontier go out of control, but the Sea Demon Rebellion in the south and the Hungduan Mountains will also take revenge. Even the Frost Mirror Dynasty and the Qingjiang Dynasty will try to take a step further. Lei Qiusheng put his hands behind his back, exhaled a turbid breath, and said in a cold voice, "The Black Jiao was born as a demon beast. This is its natural disadvantage. On the other hand, we are just people who killed our master and usurped the throne. We are not much stronger than it. The other 6 dynasties have been trying to find ways to balance the other forces for so many years. They will not tolerate a usurper like me to continue to exist." Got it. The shadow nodded slightly. He did not understand Lei Qiusheng's thoughts, but as the shadow of Lei Qiusheng, he only needed to obey the order. Chapter 514. Forget it. Let's not talk about this. A cold glint flashed across Lei Qiusheng's eyes as he said, "Although the cultists' invasion into the south this time is unexpected, if we use it well, it will be of help. At least the blame won't be directly placed on us. That plan can be started. Once I have a definite order, release them immediately. The south isn't ready yet. Moreover, this is the reason why we fell out with the top powers this time. If we reveal our strength now, it'll be no different from drinking poison to quench our thirst. Although we can resolve the Frost dynasties and the North's problems, the top powers definitely won't tolerate us anymore. In fact, they might even interfere directly with this matter." The shadow took a deep breath and sighed. Moreover, the evil cult's life in the south is not good enough. They are not powerful enough. If we force them to be blamed, it will not be justifiable. There is no other way. Even if we don't want to fall out with those top forces, with their existence, we are no longer on the same side. It is only a matter of time before we fall out with them. Therefore, we don't need to hide anything from them. We just need to explain it to those who have not been in contact with this circle. It is not that I am greedy for power, but after all, the follow-up plan needs a lot of manpower and material resources to be implemented. The Xinwu dynasty can't be given up now. At least, we can't give up before we reach the first stage of the plan." Lei Qiusheng shook his head gently and sighed. "The Shuangjian barbarian now thinks that we are weak and can be bullied. Our previous plan not only failed to suppress the northern frontier, but also shot ourselves in the foot. Should we ask the border army to take action?" The shadow looked serious. "If there are too many Frost Mirror barbarian coming in this time, it will not be good for our recovery. We don't have to go all out. Ask the border army to expand the protection area. We have to protect at least half of the territory in the Central Plains. At the same time, open up a path for Frost Mirror's cavalry to go south. Although those guys are on our side, they are also hungry wolves. Without a large number of blood sacrifices to make them happy, even I can't tell what will happen." Lei Qiusheng's lips curled up slightly as he sneered. "Not long after, the Xinwu dynasty will return to my rule. I can even swallow up half of the Shuangjian dynasty. After recuperating for a few years, I will turn around and swallow up the Qingjiang Empire. When that time comes, I will monopolize half of the world. Who can stop me?" "Yes." The shadow nodded slightly and disappeared into the shadows again. "Although the scheme is good, it's a pity that there will be endless troubles in the future." Lei Qiusheng put his hands behind his back and sighed. "If I hadn't been prepared, the Black Jiao would have been in a general's position. Now it's fine. The more people that come, the happier they will be. No one liked the feeling of being pressured step by step. Even Lei Qiusheng, who had expected this to happen, felt the same way. How could he not know that it was not time for those things to be exposed? If he could use the Shuangjian barbarian to defeat the northern frontier, that would be the best plan. However, with the embroidered uniform guards being replaced and the ether collapsing, Not only would the intelligence agencies in the north become dim, but even the intelligence agencies in the south would be dragged into the quagmire of war. In the huge Shimwu dynasty, the only thing that was under his control was the Central Plains, which was run by the Shadow. Therefore, Lin Yuan had schemed under his nose and led a large number of cultists to the south. This was something that he had not expected at all. He had been prepared to use the Shuangjin barbarian as a feint, waiting for the northern frontier to be exhausted before mobilizing the border army to take back the northern territory in one fell swoop. Because of all these arrangements, he could not sit back and watch the south collapse into the hands of the cultists. He could only cooperate with Lin Yuan's rhythm and lead the Frost Mirror Barbarian to the south, letting the barbarians fight with the interest groups in the south. In the hotbed of war, the cultists who preached that they were the representatives of the gods who saved the world would naturally find the best hotbed to grow their strength. Unless the barbarians used the power of the entire dynasty, they would not be able to eliminate the cultists with just a portion of the border army. The difference in strength between the two sides would rapidly shrink and then magnify. When the entire south fell apart, he would use the name of the cultists to release them. Then he could send all those who held him back or did not listen to him to hell. When they were full, they would naturally be in a good mood. At that time, he would appear and communicate with them. Then he would put on a show and drive them into the northern frontier, or the territory of the Shuangjin dynasty. Not only would he be able to recover his territory, but he would also be able to completely reshuffle the cards and make the bloated dynasty his say in the future. What interest groups in the south? What northern frontier? In the eyes of Lei Qiusheng, they were just a bunch of tools. Ever since he got in touch with them, his vision and structure had long surpassed his own level. Moreover, he had the special existence of the Shadow at his disposal. Naturally, he would be successful in doing things secretly. This time, the four major forces joined forces to attack the Shimwu dynasty, because some disobedient fellows among them were discovered. This matter attracted the attention of the top forces, and they asked Lei Qiusheng to release all the restrictions and let them search. However, Lei Qiusheng, who had a guilty conscience, was naturally unwilling to agree. Therefore, the drama of the four forces attacking one was born. Although the top forces didn't have any evidence, those people knew how terrifying they were. Not to mention seeing it, even if it was just a groundless rumor, they would quickly investigate the situation. If there were any signs of something wrong, they would directly kill them. If that fellow hadn't reacted quickly and retreated with them, there would be no survivors in the entire Shimwu dynasty now. According to the original script, Lei Qiusheng would be the biggest loser, and Lin Yuan, Lei Qiusheng, and even the combined forces of the aristocratic families, which were not as powerful as the northern frontier, would become the winners and begin to divide this fat cake. However, among these people who had already gained benefits, except for Lin Yuan, Lei Qiusheng didn't have the intention to put the others in his eyes. His real opponents had always been those high and mighty top forces. At least, this was Lei Qiusheng's plan at the moment. Moreover, the development of the matter was slowly moving in the direction he had envisioned. However, no matter whether it was the reaction of Lin Yuan or the top forces, Lei Qiusheng was an uncontrollable variable. Even if he was lucky enough to make use of the evil cult members introduced by Lin Yuan to talk about the matter, in an attempt to delay the time for the top forces to intervene in this matter, there were several changes in the cards in Lin Yuan's hands that he couldn't figure out in any case. Chapter 515. On the northern plains, the Shuangjin dynasty's supply wagons had already set out for quite some distance. Even from the highest watchtower in Donglin City, one could only see a small shadow of the convoy. It wouldn't be long before the convoy completely disappeared from their sight and stepped into the undercurrent of the conflict between the three factions. "How should I address you, General?" Keizhua urged his warhorse to catch up with Zhang Xiuzhu, who was at the front of the group, and asked with a chuckle. Keizhua preferred the 13th prince over the 500,000 Frost Mirror cavalrymen, but he knew very well that no matter which answer he chose, it was the same as choosing death. The only difference was that one would be executed immediately, while the other would be a delayed death. The only way he could find to survive was to find a way to stay on the northern frontier after this matter was over. If things didn't work out, then he would choose the 500,000 Frost Mirror cavalrymen and hide in the northern territories for a period of time. He would return to the plains after the Bloodsil tribe had declined. Even if he lost everything he had now, it was still better than losing his life. At this moment, Keiting finally understood why the third prince had given him such a lucrative task, and why the people of the large tribes had mocked him. He hadn't thought much of it when he had received the generous gifts, but now it seemed that these fellows had clearly regarded him as a dead man. If he wanted to survive, he had to curry favor with the northern frontier by hook or by crook in exchange for a period of protection from the northern frontier, or a permanent residence on the northern frontier. Because of her nervousness, she urgently needed someone to talk to. Secondly, Keijua's abilities lay in his cultivation and horseback. If he wanted to make a living after joining the northern frontier, he would have to walk the path of the army. Although Zhang Xiuzhu wasn't conspicuous yet, someone who could gain the favor of Li Zhongxing would definitely have great achievements in the future. That was why he chattered so much in order to make himself known. It could be said that he had put a lot of thought into it. Zhang Xiuzhu glanced at Keijua and rolled his eyes. He didn't say anything. He didn't have a good impression of the Shuangjian barbarian to begin with. It was already good enough that he didn't draw his sword. Furthermore, Li Zhongxing had set him up as a reclusive person who didn't know how to speak the common language of the Tianwu continent. Under such circumstances, unless he had no other choice, he naturally wouldn't speak. Although the Shuangjian barbarian were already food in his mouth, he wouldn't disregard the big picture for a little personal grudge before he was completely confident. Moreover, it was obvious that Li Zhongxing had reminded him of an opportunity that could bring even greater losses to the barbarians. Why wouldn't Zhang Xiuzhu do it? However, the Shuangjian barbarian couldn't all die in the ambush. At least 2 or 3 Frost Mirror barbarian had to be released before they could return to pass on the news that Li Zhongxing wanted the Shuangjian dynasty to know. The supply convoy had been ambushed by Shenlin Jun's reserve forces, and the convoy was almost completely wiped out. When the time came, Li Zhongxing would take the opportunity to remove the checkpoint and find a way to lead the Shuangjian barbarian to meet the real Shenlin Jun's reserve forces, including the 500,000 Frost Mirror barbarian, whose fate was already sealed. Zhang Xiuzhu had to use his great willpower to suppress himself so that he wouldn't laugh out loud. This time, the 49 knights following Zhang Xiuzhu weren't professional soldiers from the northern frontier. Some of them were hired wanderers, and some were cultivators that the Shifter Emperors Association had recruited from the Mercenary Union and the Demon Subduing Masters Association. However, most of them were trained by Luo Su of the Embroidered Uniform Guard. In terms of cultivation, these 49 knights were not inferior to the carefully selected Frost Mirror cavalry generals. Moreover, their past experiences had given them a few more abilities than the Frost Mirror cavalry generals, who rarely moved around in the mountains. In terms of stealth, concealment, and tracking, even if the Frost Mirror cavalry generals had 10 times the number of them, they still wouldn't be able to compete with them in a battlefield that they were familiar with. Therefore, once the situation became chaotic, even if they ran into Shenlin Jun's reserve forces, about 80% of them could survive. If they were lucky, they might even be able to escape from the ambush site with a few survivors. However, Zhang Xiuzhu still needed time to come up with a general plan of action. Although some of the Frost Mirror cavalry generals had to return alive, who would live and who would die was still a matter of consideration. For example, Juechen, who was the messenger, would definitely take up one of the spots. The guy who was wearing an ordinary general's armor, but was surrounded by several Frost Mirror cavalry generals, probably had a powerful background as well. As for the rest of the spots, Zhang Xiuzhu would have to consider carefully. After all, although the idea of an ambush was proposed by the northern frontier, the scapegoat would definitely be the Shenlin Jun's reserve forces. Therefore, the more people from the Shuangjian dynasty survived, the more credible the rumor that Li Zhongxing spread would be. But similarly, if all the important people survived and the ones who died were just cavalry generals, the Shuangjian dynasty would naturally become suspicious. They might even take this opportunity to launch a war directly to see the truth of the northern frontier. Therefore, Zhang Xiuzhu needed time and space to observe the situation and determine the status of the Frost Mirror cavalry generals, so that he could decide who would survive. According to the plan, the ambushers should be Zhang Xiuzhu's own people who had seized equipment from Wei River City. However, for the sake of realism, once the two sides engaged in close combat, even their own people would not hold back. If they were unlucky or not strong enough, they would die in vain. War had always been this cruel. Moreover, no one knew when the ambush would begin. Therefore, Zhang Xiuzhu's team leader had to arrange everything properly before the ambush happened. For example, he had to arrange at least 3 or 4 people around the valuable Frost Mirror barbarian. Once the battle started and the situation was not good, they would immediately cover the enemy's retreat. After all, they were all on the same side. Once the battlefield was divided, the brothers would not die even if they were captured. In order to ensure the implementation of the plan, Zhang Xiuzhu had even prepared a plan to completely wipe out. Fortunately, the people he brought with him were all elites. They did not have any combat strength or reaction time problems. As long as Zhang Xiuzhu gave the order, or if things deviated from his expectations, they would be able to react immediately. For a scholarly general like Zhang Xiuzhu, he only needed to be a wise man. Naturally, they would carry out the plan in a way that maximized their benefits. It was just that with Kezhua constantly chattering in his ear, not to mention that Zhang Xiuzhu's heart-nurturing kung fu had not yet reached the great accomplishment stage. Even if he could reach the stage of being indifferent, it would still be difficult for him to ignore Kezhua, who was like a fly. Helplessly, he could only give an officer next to him a look. Chapter 516. The latter immediately understood and welcomed him with a smile. Young clan leader, please don't make things difficult for our team leader. He's still familiar with this area, and we still need him to lead the way. If he gets distracted and takes the wrong path into the deep mountains and forests, we'll all become food for the demonic beasts. Besides, our leader doesn't speak the common language. We're the only ones who can communicate with him. If you have anything to say, why don't you tell me? I'll pass it on to both sides later. The officer quickly pulled Keiting away from Zhang Xiuzhu with a warm smile on his face. Never in his wildest dreams would Keiting have imagined that this smiling fellow was actually one of the famous torturers of the Imperial Secret Service. Who knew how many skins he had personally peeled off, not to mention how proficient he was in other cruel methods of torture. But just this smile alone made Keiting, whose heart was in turmoil, feel a deep sense of security. At this moment, the two of them were undoubtedly chatting happily, as if they were close friends who were talking and laughing as they walked further and further away. Zhang Xiuzhu looked at the backs of the two people as they disappeared into the distance. Then he faintly sighed and said in his heart, "Why don't I just kill them? It's so annoying to always have a fly by my side." The group advanced for another 4 hours. They were less than half an hour away from the Frost Mirror cavalry's encampment. However, Zhang Xiuzhu, who was at the front of the group, suddenly raised his right hand. In that instant, whether it was the cavalry or the supply troops, they all stopped in their tracks and carefully drew their weapons. The Frost Mirror cavalry, who was already suspicious of these northern frontier people, was shocked. They also drew their weapons. But the targets of the two sides were completely different. The northern frontier people were guarding the dense forest in front of them, while the Frost Mirror cavalry were guarding against these people from the northern frontier. After a few breaths, the Frost Mirror cavalry realized that the people from the northern frontier people weren't targeting them. But even though they were embarrassed, they didn't put down their weapons. They were still on high alert, as if they were worried that the people from the northern frontier people were putting on a show. They were waiting for them to lower their guard before attacking. "General, may I ask what's going on?" Keiting whispered to a few of his trusted generals. Then, he rode to the front of the formation to ask about the situation. "There are no beasts in the forest. Even a startled bird wouldn't fall. What do you think is going on?" Zhang Xiuzhu glanced at Keitung and said something in code, which the genial officer passed on to Keitung. According to the original plan, there would be an ambush on the way. But the location of the ambush surprised Zhang Xiuzhu. This place was only a few minutes away from the Shuangjian dynasty's military camp. As long as they passed through this dense forest, they would enter the open plains. Then they would arrive at the place where the Frost Mirror cavalry was gathered. If the commander of the Divine Forest Guard wasn't an idiot, he wouldn't have set up an ambush in such a place. After all, if the commotion caused by the battle had attracted the attention of the Frost Mirror cavalry, these starving fellows would quickly realize that there were no armed forces from the northern region in this dense forest that blocked their path of retreat. It was just a little more troublesome to travel. After passing through this forest, they would be able to reach Eastwood City, and then return to the Frost Mirror Plains through the main road there. Letting the Frost Mirror cavalry see a way out was a small matter. After all, most of the troops in the Northern Territory had gathered here, and the encampment wasn't too far away. If the Frost Mirror cavalry gave up on their mobility and entered the forest, they would lose at least 40% of their men before they could make it to the other end of the forest. Furthermore, there was a group of troops from the Southern Army blocking their path. When the pursuers met up with the Southern expedition, they would be able to surround the Frost Mirror cavalry and take them down. The only thing they had to be careful about was that if the two groups of Frost Mirror cavalry encountered each other, they could use their mobility advantage to surround the Frost Mirror cavalry. It was hard to say whether the Frost Mirror cavalry would be surrounded by the northern frontier or the southern expedition. Therefore, the ambush in front of them either had the confidence to take them down in an instant, or it was really an ambush. Moreover, it was an ambush that didn't know the current situation. Of course, the ambush wasn't the obedient rebel army of the aristocratic families punished by Li Zhongxing in the north. It was the real Shenlin Jun's reserve force. Although these guys ran out of Wei River City, they didn't take any supplies with them except for their armor and weapons. If it wasn't for the food stored in the underground tunnel, many of the hundreds of thousands of people would have starved to death. In any case, this show was most likely real. The camouflaged troops had either been eliminated, or were waiting for their prey in a further place, or they had been set up by Li Zhongxing on their way back. It was just that this ambush was a little too amateurish. Not only did they clear the entire forest of wild beasts, they didn't even chase away the birds above them. Anyone who didn't know anything about the art of war, or didn't pay attention to the details would definitely choose to go around this forest and choose another path. Were these guys really the elite Shenlin Jun's reserve force? Zhang Xiuzhu reached out and patted his forehead. His face was gloomy as he raised his right hand and gently pressed it forward twice. According to the organization of the northern region, a heavy wagon was equipped with 4 civilian laborers and 2 auxiliary soldiers whose fighting strength was not as good as the frontline troops. However, Li Zhongxing had long replaced the civilian laborers and the auxiliary soldiers with the good soldiers of the Southern Expedition Army, who did not look like much. Now they had 85 generals with good fighting strength and 1,200 elite soldiers at their disposal. It sounded good, but if they really encountered the hundreds of thousands of Shenlin Jun's reserve force, it would be no different from delivering food to them. In fact, without the protection of seniors like the Fallen Star Army, Zhang Xiuzhu felt that even if they encountered a group of defeated soldiers, even if the difference in numbers between the two sides wasn't that big, their chances of winning were really low. After all, the ordinary soldiers of Shenlin Jun's reserve force were basically equal to most of the Frost warriors on the battlefield. The Northern Frontier's reserve force might have more elite soldiers, but the difference wasn't that big. As for the combat strength of those elite soldiers, in a battle of this level, it was almost negligible. Fortunately, not many people noticed that something was wrong. Following Zhang Xiuzhu's order, a group of 10 elite soldiers instantly broke away from the formation and entered the dense forest in front of them with swords and shields in their hands. Soon, they were blocked by the dense weeds and tree trunks. Zhang Xiuzhu turned his horse slightly, closed his eyes slightly, and began to count silently. 1, 2, 3. Chapter 5:17. 15 breaths. Zhang Xiuzhu's eyes suddenly widened. He raised his right hand and made a fist. The elite soldiers who received the order immediately overturned the supply wagons beside them. They used these not-so-sturdy wooden wagons to build a temporary and simple fortification. Then they raised their swords and shields and hid behind the supply wagons. Zhang Xiuzhu and his brothers also dismounted and retreated to the back of the fortifications. Clearly, the Mount Frost generals weren't too happy about this. After all, they spent most of their time on horseback. If they dismounted and fought these northern frontier soldiers on foot, they wouldn't even be able to last one round. They wouldn't even have the chance to escape. On the other hand, Keitung, who had been whispering into Zhang Xiuzhu's ear, jumped down from her horse and hid behind the fortifications. Many Mount Frost generals rolled their eyes at her. Whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. Before the Judgment Frost cavalry could reprimand them, the sharp sound of something tearing through the air rang out. Before the 34 Frost Mirror Riders could react, 11 of them were shot down by the volley of arrows. The rest of them also had a few arrows stuck in their bodies. Although the arrows weren't fatal for a short period of time, they still affected their mobility. This volley of arrows had basically crippled half of the Frost Mirror Riders' combat strength. As for Zhang Xiuzhu and his party, who had long anticipated this, they were practically unscathed. Most of the arrows were nailed to the supply wagons, while a small number of arrows were blocked by the shields. Of course, there were a few unlucky fellows who were still hit by the arrows. Those who were slightly luckier were shot in the arms and calves, which affected their combat strength but wasn't fatal. Those who were unlucky had their heads cleanly shot by an arrow. This time, Zhang Xiuzhu and the others didn't need to waste any more words. The remaining Frost Mirror cavalry immediately dismounted from their horses, which they viewed as their lover, and scrambled into the fortifications of the supply wagons. They began to wail like ghosts and howl like wolves. The Mirror Frost dynasty only had two battle styles. The first was to use cavalry and archers to harass the enemy, while slowly trailing behind them. The second was to directly charge forward with the army. They didn't care about losses and only wanted to engage in close combat with the enemy. Of course, aside from the boorish ones, the Mirror Frost generals who could make the latter battle strategy were basically all confident that they would win. Who are these guys? Keitung was trembling all over. His teeth chattered as he spoke. It was so loud that one would worry that he would bite his tongue. Zhang Xiuzhu's lips curled up. A bitter smile appeared on his face. He ordered in code, "Repair the fortification. Move the extra supply wagons to the front. We will wait for 1 or 2 more rounds of attack to see how strong the enemy is." To put it bluntly, there was no first place in literature and no second place in martial arts. Everyone knew that during the time of the Wanjian dynasty, Lei Qiuxing, Yan Xingqi, and their personal guards were all elites in the world and were equally matched. In Lei Qiuxing's dynasty, after a few decades of development, the Divine Forest Army had become the #1 army in the Xingwu dynasty with the title of the world's #1 step, becoming a legend among legends. However, everyone in the northern frontier felt that Lei Qiuxing's era was about to end. A new era that belonged to Lin Yuan was about to begin. Shen Lin Jun, the world's #1 heavy infantry, should have retired from the stage. Who would become the first army in the northern frontier? This was the long-cherished wish of almost every soldier in the northern frontier. They had the northern frontier to defend, the southern frontier to attack, and the experienced and ruthless Star Fall. There were also the graduates of the Star General class that Lin Yuan personally led. It was said that they had formed a secret special unit that had yet to be officially revealed. The scale of the southern expedition was too large. Sooner or later, different units would be assigned to different territories. Zhang Xiuzhu wanted to work hard with Donglin City as his goal. Although his real opponent was the Shuangjian dynasty, this didn't stop Zhang Xiuzhu from having the idea of personally training his own troops as the northern frontier's #1 army. Most of the people in front of him now were Shen Lin Jun's reserves. If he didn't even have the guts to challenge the reserves, how could Zhang Xiuzhu still have the face to compete for the title of the northern frontier's #1 army? Even if his troops did become the strongest army in the northern frontier in the future, his concession to Shen Lin Jun's reserves today would fiercely nail him to the pillar of shame. Even if he obtained that title, he wouldn't dare to openly show it. Although most of the people present were not Zhang Xiuju's subordinates, they were at the top of the Southern Expedition's food chain. Naturally, they wouldn't have the idea of directly retreating after hearing the other party's name. Now that Zhang Xiuju wanted to stay and fight with the other party, for them, it was something they couldn't ask for more. The other party shouldn't have a lot of people. They are just a defeated army. Zhang Xiuju slightly raised his eyebrows and sneered. Although the ambush technique is lame, if it weren't for our quick reaction, they could have leisurely come up and killed us one by one. This level of attack isn't something that can be done by just anyone, so their identity is correct. The only thing that is wrong is the number of people. You mean? Officer Gung quickly took over the conversation, squinted his eyes and said, the other party deliberately covered up their marching tracks and scattered in the territory of the northern frontier. They just want us to focus on their original marching route. But in fact, the people who are still marching along their original marching route are almost all abandoned pawns? Zhang Xiuju nodded slightly and continued. Also, if they have enough people, they should have come up to fight us at close range after seeing that we have finished building the fortifications and exposed their existence with the rain of arrows. But they haven't done anything yet. I think they are either the allies of the 500,000 Frost Mirror Cavalry, or they don't have enough people and don't have the confidence to fight us at close range. The rain of arrows just now came suddenly and uniformly. Zhang Xiuju only heard the loud sound of bowstrings being released. Obviously, these people had drawn their bows, pulled their strings, and released their bows at almost the same time, so the countless sounds converged into one loud sound. This was not something that an ordinary army could do, but Zhang Xiuju's command was good, and his subordinates reacted quickly. Even building the fortifications with local materials was only a matter of seconds. This was not something that an ordinary army could do. So even if the other party was Shen Linjun's reserve force, they had no choice but to take Zhang Xiuju's army seriously. Chapter 518. Both sides have about the same number of people. We still don't know who will kill who. Gung Su was obviously not someone who was afraid of trouble. He immediately sneered. How about we organize a counterattack? If they don't want to come out of the forest, we will rush in and play with them. Gung Su was a member of the Genie Guards. He was Yu Dingchen, the one who received the order from Li Zhong. After delivering Li Zhong's handwritten document to Li Zhongxing, Yu Dingchen didn't immediately return to the safe Shunning City. Instead, he chose to stay at the front line to help the southern expedition. Although the ones sent to occupy the source of Wei River were a few subdivisions of the southern expedition, it didn't mean that the main force didn't lack manpower. Based on the current tragic degree of one army against a country, Li Zhongxing's troops had to be at least 3 times more than before to have the capital to be strong. Zhang Xiuju gently shook his head and sighed. No matter what, the other side is the world's elite Shen Linjun. Even if they are in the reserve force, they are not much weaker than us. If we rush in and fight with them, it won't be called a war. Speaking of this, Zhang Xiujuan paused and smiled bitterly. It's called delivering food. Yu Dingchen, who was originally calmed down by Zhang Xiuju, suddenly changed his expression. Even the hot blood in his chest cooled down a lot. Whether he admitted it or not, Zhang Xiuju's judgment was correct. After all, since ancient times, soldiers fought soldiers, generals fought generals. No one would give up the identity of a purple-level general to kill a small group of soldiers. In this case, the elite soldiers of the northern frontier were obviously not inferior to anyone. But only Shen Linjun was outside of common sense. This army that was firmly controlled by Lei Qiuxing recruited new soldiers every year. They were not selecting soldiers at all. Instead, they were selecting people who had the qualifications to become generals, and bringing them back to Wei River City for training. Therefore, it was not an exaggeration to say that Shen Linjun's reserve force was all generals. Not to mention their army, looking at the entire northern frontier, except for the 5,000 Star Fallen army, there was probably only the secret army formed by the Star class that could win against Shen Linjun's reserve force. After all, Shen Linjun was selecting generals, but the Star class selection of recruits was almost like selecting monsters. Zhang Xiuju, a scholarly general, could be regarded as a confidant and successor by Li Zhongxing after meeting Li Zhongxing face to face. Naturally, he had the ability, and he was only qualified to be invited to the star class for an interview. If he rejected it, then so be it. It was as if Lin Yuan had never cared about him. Although Li Zhongxing had the title of Southern Expedition General, in fact, he had only been brought out of Shen Linjun's reserve force for a little more than a year. However, this did not mean that Li Zhongxing was a newcomer to the battlefield. On the contrary, with Luo Su's teaching and the process of fighting against various aristocratic families in the north, Li Zhongxing's growth speed could be said to be leaps and bounds. He quickly implemented the knowledge that he had learned in Wei River City. The current Li Zhongxing could not be said to be a famous general who could move unhindered in the world. But his level was not inferior to veteran generals who had fought hundreds of battles on the battlefield. Just based on this point, one could tell what kind of monsters were in the star class, not to mention those talented generals that Lin Yuan had focused on recruiting. Any one of them, after training for a period of time and turning their theoretical knowledge into experience, could be in existence that could lead a large army by themselves. We can't beat them, but that doesn't mean that I can't deal with them. My soldiers! Zhang Xiuzhu leaned against the fortifications and roared in a low voice. The elite soldiers around instantly cast their gazes over. Zhang Xiuzhu smiled and nodded, saying, "What you faced just now was not the aristocratic family's rebel army, not the roaming bandits of the forest, but the divine martial heavy steps. Shen Linjun." Speaking up to this point, Zhang Xiuzhu paused, and said with a bit of ridicule, "Of course it's the reserve force. As the saying goes, a person's name is like a tree's shadow. Shen Linjun's name was well known throughout the world. Even the people of the northern frontier had heard of this invincible army that gathered the leaders of the Xinwu dynasty. If they were told that the ambush was Shen Linjun, even if these elite soldiers had a strong sense of bravery in their hearts, they would not do something that would send them to their deaths. However, Zhang Xiuzhu pointed out that the other party was a reserve force, and even used a ridiculing tone to speak, which immediately drove away the nervousness in the hearts of many people. After the surrounding atmosphere calmed down a little, Zhang Xiuzhu continued, "Of course, Shen Linjun has been an army for decades, and the requirements for recruiting soldiers are basically the king of soldiers or the talented orphans of the battlefield. However, my southern expedition has been an official army for less than half a year. Asking you to go and risk your lives is a bit too much." This? The corner of Yu Dingchen's mouth twitched crazily. Listening to the continuous roaring laughter, he felt that his whole body was not good. Is there anyone who can boost morale like this? Just come up and tell your own soldiers that you can't beat them at all. Then why are you still here? Isn't it better to escape early? But it's not that we don't have a chance of winning. Zhang Xiuzhu's tone suddenly changed, and with a touch of the aura of a powerful army, he said in a deep voice, "We can't beat them, but you did a good job before." At this moment, Shen Linjun probably thinks that our group is one of the best in the northern frontier, and that we might be on par with them. Therefore, after they took advantage of us with the rain of arrows, they don't dare to come out and fight with us. Team leader, what do you mean by win? A burly man slowly stood up and asked doubtfully, "We can't beat them in a fight. Why don't we take advantage of the fact that they are suspicious of us to retreat, and stay here to wait for them to react?" Obviously, this man was a typical person who was frightened by Shen Linjun's name. As soon as he heard that they were no match for Shen Linjun, he immediately wanted to retreat. If it weren't for the fact that military orders were absolute, this man would have already started to run away. Therefore, when Zhang Xiuzhu tried to boost morale, he took the initiative to stand up and try to persuade Zhang Xiuzhu to withdraw the troops. Use your stupid brain and think about it. Shen Linjun is hiding in the dense forest. They can see us, but we can't see them. Why didn't they take advantage of the long-range attack after they took advantage of us? Instead, why did they stay silent? Yu Dingchen angrily pointed at the burly man and sneered. With this little ability, you still have the face to say that you are a graduate of the Northern Frontier Academy? I advise you to go back to the furnace as soon as possible. Don't disgrace the Northern Frontier soldiers. Not to mention all kinds of supplies. They might not even be able to find people. That's why the *T of breaking up into smaller groups and sneaking into other places is just to fool people. They split up into various small groups simply because their main group can't support so many people. They can only be separated and left to fend for themselves. That's why we've only encountered some abandoned remnants. That's why they don't dare to show themselves even now. Zhang Xiuzhu stretched out his hand and pointed at the dense forest in front of them. He grinned and said, "What you're facing now isn't the world's number one. It's just a group of defeated and abandoned dregs. Can anyone tell me how we're going to lose against such dregs?" Pa. Zhang Xiuzhu stretched out his hand and slapped his face as he spoke. He said coldly, "We can't lose this battle, and we can't lose. Anyway, Zhang Xiuzhu can't afford to lose face like this. I think everyone here can't afford to lose face like this either. Fight to the death. Fight to the death." Zhang Xiuzhu's method of mobilizing the troops' morale wasn't brilliant, but it was very clever. Firstly, he directly stated that with their strength, they would definitely be annihilated if they engaged in hand-to-hand combat. This made certain people who were eager to gain merit and disregarded the consequences would have no choice but to obediently stay behind the fortifications and listen to Zhang Xiuzhu's arrangements. Secondly, Zhang Xiuzhu fully analyzed the situation of the troops opposite them. In an atmosphere of near despair, he forcibly described the reserves of the world's number one army as smelly trash. This allowed them to see the dawn of victory in their despair. Thirdly, Zhang Xiuzhu bluntly called the other party dregs. If he lost this battle, wouldn't it mean that their team was even worse than dregs? No one was willing to lose face. Even Zhang Xiuzhu, who had lost both his parents and begged from door to door every day when he was young. Zhang Xiuzhu, who relied on hundreds of families to survive, couldn't afford to lose face like this. Not only would these people, who had relatives and friends, die in society, but even their relatives and friends would also be unable to raise their heads. Pa. Hearing the shouts around him, Zhang Xiuzhu gently clapped his hands to signal for everyone to be quiet. He smiled and said, "All right, although these dregs have become the first step to our fame, if we want to win this battle, we still have to follow my arrangements. Now let's bury the pot and cook." The corner of Yu Dingchen's mouth twitched violently again. What the F***ck is he playing at? First, he stirred up the morale of the troops with a set of twists and turns. This bastard actually didn't take advantage of this time to do anything meaningful. Instead, he wanted the troops to bury the pot and cook, as if everyone had been hungry all this time. "I know you guys don't know why I want you to bury the pot and cook. Actually, I don't want to explain it." Zhang Xiuzhu watched the troops begin to prepare, then he smiled and said, "But just in case, I advise you guys to use this time to adjust the crossbows and familiarize yourself with the swords. Otherwise, when those guys rush out later, you guys won't even be able to withstand the first round. Those Shenlin Jun reserve soldiers inside don't know when the last time they had a proper meal is. If we cook here, once the aroma spreads out, it would be strange if they obediently watch." "Awesome team." After a short moment of silence, a young soldier suddenly yelled out. Even if they were on the plains, they might not be able to beat him, let alone in the dense forest with complicated terrain. These Shenlin Jun reserve soldiers had been on guard for the past 2 days. Zhang Xiuzhu really didn't have the confidence to take down this tough bone. After all, they were a group of elite soldiers. If they only relied on the geographical advantage of the dense forest to defend themselves, even if Li Zhongxing and his personal guards came over, there was no way they could win this battle. However, these Shenlin Jun reserve soldiers didn't attack them because they hated the people from the northern frontier. From the very beginning, their goal was to escort this batch of supplies. After all, the transport team of the Northern Territory Chamber of Commerce wasn't something that a group of defeated soldiers could challenge in terms of size and strength. Therefore, the Frost Mirror Cavalry wasn't the only ones who couldn't get supplies. Chapter 520. The supply troops brought back 2 bags of food that were scattered outside the attack range of the forest. They quickly started cooking. However, The rest of the troops didn't chat like they usually did when they were waiting for their meals. Instead, they silently used whetstones to test the sharpness of their weapons. A group of soldiers with strange crossbows were squatting behind the simple fortifications. They were all listening to the movements on the other side of the fortifications. To them, the enemy that attacked first was nothing but prey. "Brother Yu, what did your team leader say?" Kei Tung, who was sitting cross-legged on the ground, turned his head and asked Yu Dingchen. His face was pale from fear. He didn't know who the ambushers in the forest were, but they definitely weren't the Frost Mirror cavalry. The arrows they used weren't the arrows of the Frost Mirror grassland. Even if the Frost Mirror cavalry were starving, they wouldn't attack their own people. "Our commander said that there's a group of troublesome enemies hiding in the forest ahead. If we rush in and engage them in hand-to-hand combat, we'll lose without a doubt." Yu Dingchen chewed on the jerky in his hand as he spoke slowly. "But their target is our supplies. If we start cooking here, they'll take the risk and rush out of the forest to attack us. At that time, we can rely on the fortifications to kill them one by one." The reason Yu Dingchen was eating jerky wasn't because he had the privilege of an officer. It was because 500 of them, including him, were chosen to be Shen Linjun's reserve troops. They were the last line of defense near the fortifications. Once that happened, they had to rush out and engage the enemy in hand-to-hand combat to buy time and space for the archers behind them to kill the enemy. "Then did your team leader say who the other party was?" Kei Ting looked at the jerky in Yu Dingchen's hand and swallowed his saliva as he asked in a low voice. Because Zhang Xiuzhu was a meticulous person, he always remembered what his persona was. Even when he was trying to boost morale, he was still using the code words of the Northern Frontier Army. Therefore, from what Kei Ting heard, the mute general was constantly telling his troops unknown numbers, and yet he was still able to stir up everyone's emotions. That was why Kei Ting asked this question out of curiosity. It wasn't that he hadn't thought that the enemy in the forest was the army of the northern region, but Zhang Xiuzhu and his men had reacted too quickly. The sentries who had gone into the forest to scout the situation hadn't even come out in a dozen breaths. They had immediately overturned the supply wagons and withstood the first salvo. Kei Ting did not believe that this was Zhang Xiuzhu's prediction. After all, if such an outstanding general was placed in the Shuangjian dynasty, he would at least be a major commander who commanded tens of thousands of cavalry. He would not be a direct subordinate of only 5 people. All of this seemed like a script that the northern frontier had prepared in advance. But after giving it some thought, Kei Ting felt that this wasn't the case. If the Northern Territory wanted to send people to disguise themselves as other troops to ambush and kill, they would first have to let these people see the other party's armor or identification. Then, while they were charging in, they would also make sure to leave behind some of the more important people among them as witnesses to report back to the Empire. This would infuriate the Reflection Frost dynasty. However, the enemy had no intention of showing up until now. Moreover, the previous attacks had no intention of leaving anyone alive. The only reason they were able to survive the first round of attacks was because of their cultivation and riding skills. After dodging the scythe of the Grim Reaper, they were able to roll and crawl behind the temporary fortifications. Pfft! Yu Dingchen sneered and narrowed his eyes. The Shuangjian dynasty might not have many spies, but that doesn't mean they don't know anything about the Frost Mirror Plains, right? Young clan leader, how many troops do you think there are in the north that can be considered troublesome to deal with? Aside from the Shuangjian dynasty's Blood Liao Knights, the only force that could influence the north was Shen Linjun. Thinking of this, Kei Ting's lips trembled. He whispered, "Are you guys crazy? How dare we challenge Shen Linjun with just the few of us? No wonder your team leader said that if we fought hand to hand, you would lose without a doubt." At this point, Kei Ting's expression changed slightly and he continued, "Also, if it really is the Divine Forest Army, your crossbow bolts may not be able to penetrate their armor. Fighting a positional battle is only delaying them a little. If this continues, we will all die." Yu Dingchen shook his head and smiled. "What Shen Linjun? They are just a bunch of defeated soldiers who have abandoned their armor. Not to mention that their armor might not be useful. Even if it could block our arrows, they wouldn't have the guts to wear it. After all, The Divine Forest Army's reserve force had already been crushed by Gao Jia. The group of soldiers who had escaped were already in a state of panic. When the army couldn't afford to feed so many people, not only would they be chased out of the group, even the armor or training uniform that could prove their identity would be taken away. If the defeated soldiers were to flee in the north, they would encounter the Northern Frontier Army sooner or later. If a few powerful characters appeared, it would be easy for them to calculate the movement path of the defeated soldiers based on where they appeared. Then they would be able to annihilate them. As a precaution, when the defeated soldiers were kicked out of the group, everything that could prove their identity would be taken away. When a tiger lost its claws and teeth, and an elephant lost its skin, these so-called fierce beasts, what was there to be afraid of? At this point, Yu Dingchen raised the jerky in his hand and said with a smile, "There's also this food. After eating it, you'll have to rush out and engage in close combat with the enemy when they're close enough to buy time for the archers behind. I see that you have been staring at it. Do you want to eat?" Keijua's expression changed slightly. While he grew up in a harsh environment like the Frost Mirror grassland, and was at the pinnacle of the airborne realm, as the young chief of the Green Fish tribe, how much danger could he have encountered? Many years of living like a prince had long since wiped away the courage in Keijua's body, and what little courage he had left was not enough to support his courage to charge out and engage in close combat with the enemy after knowing the identity of the enemy. Therefore, after a moment of hesitation, Keijua shook his head very calmly. It was obvious that he had overcome his appetite. They were all elite soldiers, so they carried out orders very quickly. It didn't take long for the aroma of the stewed rice to spread. Not only did it spread to the jungle, but even the simple fortifications had many people drooling. However, everyone knew that the cooking was just to lure the enemy out. At the very least, they had to wait until the upcoming battle was over before they could enjoy the meal. You're tuning in to the Li Mei's Wuxia Whispers YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.